Chapter 58.
It looked as though I was going to make it back to the road all right. And I was thankful for it. Because 7 o'clock in the morning, with the wintry dawn only just beginning to lighten the eastern rim of the moor, was no time to be digging my car out of the snow. This narrow, unfenced road skirted a high tableland, and gave onto a few lonely farms at the end of even narrower tracks. It hadn't actually been snowing on my way out to this early call, a uterine hemorrhage in a cow, but the wind had been rising steadily and whipping the top surface from the white blanket which had covered the fell tops for weeks. My headlights had picked out the creeping drifts, pretty, pointed fingers feeling their way inch by inch across the strip of tarmac. This was how all blocked roads began, and at the farm, as I injected Petruitrin and packed the bleeding cervix with a clean sheet, I could hear the wind buffeting the byre door, and wondered if I would win the race home. On the way back, the drifts had stopped being pretty, and lay across the road like white bolsters. But my little car had managed to cleave through them, veering crazily at times, wheels spinning, and now I could see the main road a few hundred yards ahead, reassuringly black in the pale light. But just over there on the left, a field away, was Cote House. I was treating a bullock there. He had eaten some frozen turnips, and a visit was fixed for today. I didn't fancy trailing back up here if I could avoid it, and there was a light in the kitchen window. The family were up, anyway. I turned and drove down into the yard. The farmhouse door lay within a small porch, and the wind had driven the snow inside, forming a smooth 2-foot heap against the timbers. As I leant across to knock, the surface of the heap trembled a little, then began to heave. There was something in there. Something quite big. It was eerie standing in the half-light, watching the snow parting to reveal a furry body. Some creature of the wild must have strayed in, searching for warmth, but it was bigger than a fox or anything else I could think of. Just then the door opened and the light from the kitchen streamed out. Peter Trenham beckoned me inside, and his wife smiled at me from the bright interior. They were a cheerful young couple. "What's that?" I gasped, pointing at the animal which was shaking the snow vigorously from its coat. "That?" Peter grinned. "That's our Tip." "Tip, your dog? But what's he doing under a pile of snow?" "Well, just blew in on him, I reckon. That's where he sleeps, you know, just outside the back door." I stared at the farmer. "You mean he sleeps out there, out in the open, every night?" "Aye, allus. Summer and winter. But don't look at me like that, Miss Herriot. It's his own choice. The other dogs have a warm bed in the cowhouse, but Tip won't entertain it. He's 15 now, and he's been sleeping out there since he were a pup. I remember when my father was alive, he tried all ways to get our fella to sleep inside, but it was no good." I looked at the old dog in amazement. I could see him more clearly now. He wasn't the typical sheepdog type. He was bigger-boned, longer in the hair, and he projected a bursting vitality that didn't go with his 15 years. It was difficult to believe that any animal living in those bleak uplands should choose to sleep outside, and thrive on it. I had to look closely to see any sign of his great age. There was the slightest stiffness in his gait as he moved around. Perhaps a fleshless look about his head and face, and, of course, the telltale lens opacity in the depths of his eyes. But the general impression was of an unquenchable jauntiness. He shook the last of the snow from his coat, pranced jerkingly up to the farmer, and gave a couple of reedy barks. Peter Trenham laughed. "You see, he's ready to be off. He's a beggar for work, is Tip." He led the way towards the buildings, and I followed, stumbling over the frozen ruts like iron under the snow, and bending my head against the knife-like wind. It was a relief to open the byre door and escape into the sweet bovine warmth. There was a fair mixture of animals in the long building. The dairy cows took up most of the length. Then there was a few young heifers, some bullocks, and finally, in an empty stall deeply bedded with straw, the other farm dogs. The cats were there too, so it had to be warm. No animal is a better judge of comfort than a cat, and they were just visible as furry balls in the straw. They had the best place, up against the wooden partition where the warmth came through from the big animals. Tip strode confidently among his colleagues, a young dog and a bitch with 3 half-grown pups. You could see he was the boss. One of the bullocks was my patient, and he was looking a bit better. When I had seen him yesterday, his rumen, the big first stomach, had been completely static, anatonic, following an over-eager consumption of frozen turnips. He had been slightly bloated and groaning with discomfort. But today, as I leant with my ear against his left side, I could hear the beginnings of the surge and rumble of the normal rumen instead of the deathly silence of yesterday. My gastric lavage had undoubtedly tickled things up, and I felt that another of the same would just about put him right. Almost lovingly, I put together the ingredients of one of my favourite treatments, long since washed away in the flood of progress. The ounce of formalin, the half-pound of common salt, the can of black treacle from the barrel, which you used to find in most cowhouses, all mixed up in a bucket with 2 gallons of hot water. I jammed the wooden gag into the bullock's mouth and buckled it behind the horns. Then, as Peter held the handles, I passed the stomach tube down into the rumen and pumped in the mixture. When I had finished, the bullock opened his eyes wide in surprise and began to paddle his hind legs. Listening again at his side, I could hear the reassuring bubblings of the stomach contents. I smiled to myself in satisfaction. It worked. It always worked. Wiping down the tube, I could hear the hiss-hiss as Peter's brother got on with the morning's milking. And as I prepared to leave, he came down the byre with a full bucket on the way to the cooler. As he passed the dog stall, he tipped a few pints of the warm milk into their dishes, and Tip strolled forward casually for his breakfast. While he was drinking, the young dog tried to push his way in, but a soundless snap from Tip's jaws missed his nose by a fraction, and he retired to another dish. I noticed, however, that the old dog made no protest as the bitch and pups joined him. The cats, black and white, tortoiseshell, tabby grey, appeared, stretching from the straw, and advanced in a watchful ring. Their turn would come. Mrs. Trenham called me in for a cup of tea, and when I came out, it was fully daylight. But the sky was a burdened grey, and the sparse trees near the house strained their bare branches against the wind, which drove in long, icy gusts over the white, empty miles of moor. It was what the Yorkshireman called a thin wind, or sometimes a lazy wind, the kind that couldn't be bothered to blow round you, but went straight through instead. It made me feel that the best place on earth was by the side of this bright fire in the farmhouse kitchen. Most people would have felt like that, but not old Tip. He was capering around as Peter loaded a flat cart with some hay bales for the young cattle in the outside barns, and as Peter shook the reins and the cob set off over the fields, he leapt onto the back of the cart. As I threw my tackle into the boot, I looked back at the old dog, legs braced against the uneven motion, tail waving, barking defiance at the cold world. I carried away the memory of Tip, who scorned the softer things and slept in what he considered the place of honour, at his master's door. A little incident like this has always been able to brighten my day. And fortunately, I had the kind of job where things of this kind happened. And sometimes it isn't even a happening, just a single luminous phrase. As when I was examining a cow one morning while its neighbour was being milked. The milker was an old man, and he was having trouble. He was sitting well into the cow, his cloth-capped head buried in her flank, the bucket gripped tightly between his knees, but the stool kept rocking about as the cow fidgeted and weaved. Twice she kicked the bucket over, and she had an additional little trick of anointing her tail with particularly liquid feces, then lashing the old man across the face with it. Finally, he could stand it no longer. Leaping to his feet, he dealt a puny blow at the cow's scraggy back and emitted an exasperated shout. "Stand still, thou shitting-out Bovril!" Or the day when I had to visit Luke Benson at his small holding in Hillam village. Luke was a powerful man of about 60, and had the unusual characteristic of speaking always through his clenched teeth. He literally articulated every word by moving only his lips, showing the rows of square horse-like incisors clamped tightly together. It lent a peculiar intensity to his simplest utterance. As he spoke, his eyes glared. Most of his conversations consisted of scathing remarks about the other inhabitants of Hillam. In fact, he seemed to harbour a cordial dislike of the human race in general. Yet, strangely enough, I found him a very reasonable man to deal with. He accepted my diagnosis of his animal's ailments without question, and appeared to be trying to be friendly by addressing me repeatedly as James. which was the nearest he could get to my name with his teeth together. His fiercest hatred was reserved for his neighbour and fellow smallholder, a little lame man called Gill, to whom Luke referred invariably and unkindly as "yon oppin youth." A bitter feud had raged between them for many years, and I'd seen Luke smile on only 2 occasions. Once, when Mr. Gill's sow lost its litter, and again, when he had a stack burnt down. When Mr. Gill's wife ran away with a man who came round the farm selling brushes, it caused a sensation. Nothing like that had ever happened in Hillam before, and a wave of delighted horror swept through the village. This, I thought, would be the high point of Luke Benson's life, and when I had to visit a heifer of his, I expected to find him jubilant. But Luke was gloomy. As I examined and treated his animal, he remained silent, and it wasn't until I went into the kitchen to wash my hands that he spoke. He glanced round warily at his wife, a gaunt, grim-faced woman who was applying black lead to the grate. "You'll have heard about yon oppin youth's missus running off," he said. "Yes," I replied, "I did hear about it." I waited for Luke to gloat, but he seemed strangely ill at ease. He fidgeted until I had finished drying my hands. Then he glared at me and bared his strong teeth. "I'll tell you something, James," he ground out. "I wish someone would take my bugger." And there was that letter from the Bramleys. That really made me feel good. You don't find people like the Bramleys now. Radio, television, and the motor car have carried the outside world into the most isolated places, so that the simple people you used to meet on the lonely farms are rapidly becoming like people anywhere else. There are still a few left, of course. Old folk who cling to the ways of their fathers, and when I come across any of them, I like to make some excuse to sit down and talk with them and listen to the old Yorkshire words and expressions which have almost disappeared. But even in the 30s, when there were many places still untouched by the flood of progress, the Bramleys were in some ways unique. There were 4 of them. 3 brothers, all middle-aged bachelors, and an older sister, also unmarried, and their farm lay in a wide, shallow depression in the hills. You could just see the ancient tiles of Scar House through the top branches of the sheltering trees if you stood outside the pub in Drewburn village, and in the summer it was possible to drive down over the fields to the farm. I had done it a few times, the bottles in the boot jingling and crashing as the car bounced over the rig and furrow. The other approach to the place was right on the other side through Mr. Broom's stackyard, and then along a track with ruts so deep that only a tractor could negotiate it. There was, in fact, no road to the farm, but that didn't bother the Bramleys because the outside world held no great attraction for them. Miss Bramley made occasional trips to Darrowby on market days for provisions, and Herbert, the middle brother, had come into town in the spring of 1929 to have a tooth out, but apart from that, they stayed contentedly at home. A call to Scar House always came as rather a jolt, because it meant that at least 2 hours had been removed from the working day. In all but the driest weather, it was safer to leave the car at Mr. Broom's and make the journey on foot. One February night at about 8 o'clock, I was splashing my way along the track, feeling the mud sucking at my Wellingtons. It was to see a horse with colic, and my pockets were stuffed with the things I might need. A Recaline, phials of morphia, a bottle of paraphyroxia. My eyes were half closed against the steady drizzle, but about half a mile ahead I could see the lights of the house winking among the trees. After 20 minutes of slithering in and out of the unseen puddles and opening a series of broken string-tied gates, I reached the farmyard and crossed over to the back door. I was about to knock when I stopped with my hand poised. I found I was looking through the kitchen window, and in the interior, dimly lit by the oil lamp, the Bramleys were sitting in a row. They weren't grouped round the fire, but were jammed tightly in a long, high-backed wooden settle which stood against the far wall. The strange thing was the almost exact similarity of their attitudes. All 4 had their arms folded, chins resting on their chests, feet stretched out in front of them. The men had removed their heavy boots and were stocking-footed, but Miss Bramley wore an old pair of carpet slippers. I stared, fascinated by the curious immobility of the group. They were not asleep, not talking, or reading, or listening to the radio. In fact, they didn't have one. They were just sitting. I had never seen people just sitting before, and I stood there for some minutes to see if they would make a move or do anything at all, but nothing happened. It occurred to me that this was probably a typical evening. They worked hard all day, had their meal, then they just sat till bedtime. A month or two later, I discovered another unsuspected side of the Bramleys when they started having trouble with their cats. I knew they were fond of cats by the number and variety which swarmed over the place and perched confidently on my car bonnet on cold days with their unerring instinct for a warm place. But I was unprepared for the family's utter desolation when the cats started to die. Miss Bramley was on the doorstep at Scaledale House nearly every day carrying an egg basket with another pitiful patient. A cat, or sometimes a few tiny kittens, huddling miserably inside. Even today, with the full range of modern antibiotics, the treatment of feline enteritis is unrewarding. And I had little success with my salicylates and non-specific injections. I did my best. I even took some of the cats in and kept them at the surgery so that I could attend them several times a day, but the mortality rate was high. The Bramleys were stricken as they saw their cats diminishing. I was surprised at their grief because most farmers look on cats as pest killers and nothing more. But when Miss Bramley came in one morning with a fresh consignment of invalids, she was in a sorry state. She stared at me across the surgery table, and her rough fingers clasped and unclasped on the handles of the egg basket. "Is it going to go through 'em all?" she quavered. "Well, it's very infectious, and it looks as though most of your young cats will get it anyway." For a moment, Miss Bramley seemed to be struggling with herself. Then her chin began to jerk, and her whole face twitched uncontrollably. She didn't actually break down, but her eyes brimmed, and a couple of tears wandered among the network of wrinkles on her cheeks. I looked at her helplessly as she stood there, wisps of grey hair straggling untidily from under the incongruous black berry which she wore pulled tightly over her ears. "It's Topsy's kittens I'm worried about," she gasped out at length. "There's 5 of them, and they're the best we've got." I rubbed my chin. I had heard a lot about Topsy, one of a strain of incomparable ratters and mouses. Her last family were only about 10 weeks old, and it would be a crushing blow to the Bramleys if anything happened to them. But what the devil could I do? There was, as yet, no protective vaccine against the disease. But wait a minute, was there? I remembered that I'd heard a rumour that Burroughs Wellcome were working on one. I pulled out a chair. "Look, sit down for a few minutes, Miss Bramley. I'm going to make a phone call." I was soon through to the Wellcome laboratory, and half expected a sarcastic reply, but they were kind and cooperative. They had had encouraging results with the new vaccine, and would be glad to let me have 5 doses if I would inform them of the result. I hurried back to Miss Bramley. "I've ordered something for your kittens. I can't guarantee anything, but there's nothing else to do. Have them down here on Tuesday morning." The vaccine arrived promptly, and as I injected the tiny creatures, Miss Bramley extolled the virtues of the Topsy line. "Look at the size of them ears. Did you ever see bigger ones on kittens?" I had to admit that I hadn't. The ears were enormous, sail-like, and they made the ravishingly pretty little faces look even smaller. Miss Bramley nodded and smiled with satisfaction. "Aye, you can allus tell. It's the sure sign of a good mouser." The injection was repeated a week later. The kittens were still looking well. "Well, that's it," I said. "We'll just have to wait now. But remember, I want to know the outcome of this, so please don't forget to let me know." I didn't hear from the Bramleys for several months, and had almost forgotten about the little experiment when I came upon a grubby envelope, which had apparently been pushed under the surgery door. It was the promised report, and was, in its way, a model of conciseness. It communicated all the information I required without frills or verbiage. It was in a careful, spidery scrawl, and said simply, "Dear Sir, them kittens is now big cats. Yours truly, R. Bramley." Chapter 59. As I stopped my car by the group of gypsies, I felt I was looking at something which should have been captured by a camera. The grass verge was wide on this loop of the road, and there were 5 of them squatting round the fire. It seemed like the mother and father and 3 little girls. They sat very still, regarding me blankly through the drifting smoke, while a few big snowflakes floated across the scene and settled lazily on the tangled hair of the children. Some unreal quality in the wild tableau kept me motionless in my seat, staring through the glass, forgetful of the reason for my being there. Then I wound down the window and spoke to the man. "Are you Mr. Myatt? I believe you have a sick pony." The man nodded. "Aye, that's right. He's over here." It was a strange accent with no trace of Yorkshire in it. He got up from the fire, a thin, dark-skinned, unshaven little figure, and came over to the car holding out something in his hand. It was a 10-shilling note, and I recognised it as a gesture of good faith. The gypsies who occasionally wandered into Darrowby were always regarded with a certain amount of suspicion. They came, unlike the Myatts, mainly in the summer, to camp down by the river and sell their horses, and we had been caught out once or twice before. A lot of them seemed to be called Smith, and it wasn't uncommon to go back on the second day and find that patient and owner had gone. In fact, Siegfried had shouted to me as I left the house that morning, "Get the brass if you can!" But he needn't have worried. Mr. Myatt was on the up and up. I got out of the car and followed him over the grass, past the shabby ornate caravan and the lurcher dog tied to the wheel to where a few horses and ponies were tethered. My patient was easy to find. A handsome piebald of about 13 hands with good clean legs and a look of class about him. But he was in a sorry state. While the other animals moved around on their tethers, watching us with interest, the piebald stood as though carved from stone. Even from a distance I could tell what was wrong with him. Only acute laminitis could produce that crouching posture, and as I moved nearer I could see that all 4 feet were probably affected, because the pony had his hind feet right under his body in a desperate attempt to take his full weight on his heels. I pushed my thermometer into the rectum. "Has he been getting any extra food, Mr. Myatt?" "Aye. He getting into a bag of oats last night." The little man showed me the big half-empty sack in the back of the caravan. It was difficult to understand him, but he managed to convey that the pony had broken loose and gorged himself on the oats. And he had given him a dose of castor oil. He called it castor oil. The thermometer read 104, and the pulse was rapid and bounding. I passed my hand over the smooth, trembling hooves, feeling the abnormal heat. Then I looked at the taut face, the dilated nostrils and terrified eyes. Anybody who has had an infection under a fingernail can have an inkling of the agony a horse goes through, when the sensitive laminae of the foot are inflamed and throbbing against the unyielding wall of the hoof. "Can you get him to move?" I asked. The man caught hold of the head collar and pulled, but the pony refused to budge. I took the other side of the collar. "Come on. It's always better if they can get moving." We pulled together, and Mrs. Myatt slapped the pony's rump. He took a couple of stumbling steps, but it was as if the ground was red-hot and he groaned as his feet came down. Within seconds he was crouching again with his weight on his heels. "It seems he just won't have it." I turned and went back to the car. I'd have to do what I could to give him relief, and the first thing was to get rid of as much as possible of that bellyful of oats. I fished out the bottle of Arecaline and gave an injection into the muscle of the neck. Then I showed the little man how to tie cloths round the hooves so that he could keep soaking them in cold water. Afterwards I stood back and looked again at the pony. He was salivating freely from the Arecaline, and he had cocked his tail and evacuated his bowel. But his pain was undiminished, and it would stay like that until the tremendous inflammation subsided, if it ever did. I had seen cases like this where serum had started to ooze from the coronet. That usually meant shedding of the hooves, even death. As I turned over the gloomy thoughts, the 3 little girls went up to the pony. The biggest one put her arms round his neck and laid her cheeks against his shoulder while the others stroked the shivering flanks. There were no tears, no change in the blank expressions, but it was easy to see that that pony really meant something to them. Before leaving, I handed over a bottle of tincture of aconite mixture. "Get a dose of this down him every 4 hours, Mr. Myatt, and be sure to keep putting cold water on his feet. I'll come and see him in the morning." I closed the car door and looked through the window again, at the slow-rising smoke, the drifting snowflakes, and the 3 children with their ragged dresses and uncombed hair still stroking the pony. "Well, you got the brass, James," Siegfried said at lunch, carelessly stuffing the 10-shilling note into a bulging pocket. "What was the trouble?" "Worst case of laminitis I've ever seen. Couldn't move the pony at all, and he's going through hell. I've done the usual things, but I'm pretty sure they aren't going to be enough." "Not a very bright prognosis, then?" "Really black. Even if he gets over the acute stage, he'll have deformed feet, I'd like to bet. Grooved hooves, dropped soles, the lot. And he's a grand little animal, lovely piebald. I wish to God there was something else I could do." Siegfried sawed 2 thick slices of the cold mutton and dropped them on my plate. He looked thoughtfully at me for a moment. "You've been a little distrait since you came back." "These are rotten jobs, I know, but it's no good worrying." "Oh, I'm not worrying exactly, but I just can't get it off my mind. Maybe it's those people. I mean, the Myatts. They were something new to me, right out of the world. And the 3 raggedy little girls absolutely crazy about that pony. They aren't going to like it at all." As Siegfried chewed his mutton, I could see the old glint coming into his eyes. It showed when the talk had anything to do with horses. I knew he wouldn't push in, but he was waiting for me to make the first move. I made it. "Look, I wish you'd come along and have a look with me. Maybe there's something you could suggest." "Do you think there could be?" Siegfried put down his knife and fork and stared in front of him for a few seconds, then turned to me. "You know, James, there just might be. Quite obviously this is a right pig of a case, and the ordinary remedies aren't going to do any good. We have to pull something out of the bag, and I've got an idea. There's just one thing," he gave a crooked smile. "You may not like it." "Oh, don't bother about me," I said. "You're the horseman. If you can help this pony, I don't care what you do." "Right. Eat up then, and we'll go into action together." We finished our meal, and he led me through to the instrument room. I was surprised when he opened the cupboard where old Mr. Grant's instruments were kept. It was a kind of museum. When Siegfried had bought the practice from the old vet who had worked on into his 80s, these instruments had come with it, and they lay there in rows, unused but undisturbed. It would have been logical to throw them out, but maybe Siegfried felt the same way about them as I did. The polished wooden boxes of shining, odd-shaped scalpels, the anema pumps and douches with their perished rubber and brass fittings, the Seton needles, the ancient firing irons, they were a silent testament to 60 years of struggle. I often used to open the cupboard door and try to picture the old man wrestling with the same problems as I had, travelling the same narrow roads as I did. He had done it absolutely on his own, and for 60 years. I was only starting, but I knew a little about the triumphs and disasters, the wonderings and worryings, the hopes and disappointments, and the hard labour. Anyway, Mr. Grant was dead and gone, taking with him all the skills and knowledge I was doggedly trying to accumulate. Siegfried reached to the back of the cupboard and pulled out a long, flat box. He blew the dust from the leather covering and gingerly unfastened the clasp. Inside, a fleam, glittering on its bed of frayed velvet, lay by the side of a round, polished bloodstick. I looked at my employer in astonishment. "You're going to bleed him, then?" "Yes, my boy. I'm going to take you back to the Middle Ages." He looked at my startled face and put a hand on my arm. "But don't start beating me over the head with all the scientific arguments against bloodletting. I've no strong views either way." "But have you ever done it? I've never seen you use this outfit." "I've done it, and I've seen some funny things after it, too." Siegfried turned away as if he wanted no more discussion. He cleaned the fleam thoroughly and dropped it into the sterilizer. His face was expressionless as he stood listening to the hiss of the boiling water. The gypsies were again hunched over the fire when we got there, and Mr. Myatt, sensing that reinforcements had arrived, scrambled to his feet and shuffled forward, holding out another 10-shilling note. Siegfried waved it away. "Let's see how we get on, Mr. Myatt," he grunted. He strode across the grass to where the pony still trembled in his agonized crouch. There was no improvement. In fact, the eyes stared more wildly, and I could hear little groans as the piebald carefully eased himself from foot to foot. Siegfried spoke softly without looking at me. Poor beggar. You weren't exaggerating, James. Bring that box from the car, will you? When I came back, he was tying a choke rope round the base of the pony's neck. Pull it up tight, he said. As the jugular rose up, tense and turgid in its furrow, he quickly clipped and disinfected a small area and inserted a plaque of local anaesthetic. Finally, he opened the old leather-covered box and extracted the phlegm wrapped in sterile lint. Everything seemed to start happening then. Siegfried placed the little blade of the phlegm against the bulging vein and without hesitation gave it a confident smack with a stick. Immediately, an alarming cascade of blood spouted from the hole and began to form a dark lake on the grass. Mr. Myatt gasped, and the little girl set up a sudden chatter. I could understand how they felt. In fact, I was wondering how long the pony could stand this tremendous outflow without dropping down. It didn't seem to be coming out fast enough for Siegfried, however, because he produced another stick from his pocket, thrust it into the pony's mouth and began to work the jaws, and as the animal champed, the blood gushed more fiercely. When at least a gallon had come away, Siegfried seemed satisfied. "Slacken the rope, James," he cried, then rapidly closed the wound on the neck with a pin suture. Next, he trotted over the grass and looked over a gate in the roadside wall. "Thought so," he shouted. "There's a little beck in that field. We've got to get him over to it. Come on, lend a hand, everybody." He was clearly enjoying himself, and his presence was having its usual effect. The Myatts were spurred suddenly into action and began to run around aimlessly, bumping into each other. I was gripped by a sudden tension and preparedness, and even the pony seemed to be taking an interest in its surroundings for the first time. All 5 of the gypsies pulled at the halter. Siegfried and I looped our arms behind the pony's thighs, everybody gave encouraging shouts, and at last he began to move forward. It was a painful progress, but he kept going. Through the gate and across the field to where the shallow stream wandered among its rushes. There were no banks to speak of, and it was easy to push him out into the middle. As he stood there with the icy water rippling around his inflamed hooves, I fancied I could read in his eyes a faint dawning of an idea that things were looking up at last. "Now, he must stand in there for an hour," Siegfried said. "And then you'll have to make him walk round the field. Then another hour in the beck, and as he gets better you can give him more and more exercise, but he must come back to the beck. That's a lot of work for somebody here, so who's going to do it?" The 3 little girls came shyly round him and looked up wide-eyed into his face. Siegfried laughed. "You 3 want the job, do you? Right. I'll tell you just what to do." He pulled out the bag of peppermint drops, which was ever present among his widely varied pocket luggage, and I settled myself down for a long wait. I'd seen him in action with the children on the farms, and when that bag of sweets came out, everything stopped. It was the one time Siegfried was never in a hurry. The little girls each solemnly took a sweet, then Siegfried squatted on his heels and began to address them like a professor with his class. They soon began to thaw and put a word in for themselves. The smallest launched into a barely intelligible account of the remarkable things the pony had done when he was a foal, and Siegfried listened intently, nodding his head gravely now and then. There was all the time in the world. His words obviously went home, because over the next few days, whenever I passed the gypsy camp, I could see the 3 wild little figures either grouped round the pony in the beck, or dragging him round the field on a long halter shank. I didn't need to butt in. I could see that he was improving all the time. It was about a week later that I saw the Myatts on their way out of Darrowby, the red caravan rocking across the marketplace with Mr. Myatt up front wearing a black velvet cap, his wife by his side. Tethered to various parts of the caravan, the family of horses clopped along, and right at the rear was the piebald, a bit stiff perhaps, but going very well. He'd be all right. The little girls were looking out of the back door, and as they spotted me, I waved. They looked back at me unsmilingly, until they had almost turned the corner into Hallgate. Then one of them shyly lifted her hand. The others followed suit, and my last sight was of them waving eagerly back. I strolled into the drovers and took a thoughtful half-pint into a corner. Siegfried had done the trick there all right. But I was wondering what to make of it, because in veterinary practice it's difficult to draw a definite conclusion even after spectacular results. Was it my imagination, or did that pony seem to feel relief almost immediately after the bloodletting? Would we ever have got him moving without it? Was it really the right thing in these cases to bash a hole in the jugular and release about a bucketful of the precious fluid? I still don't have the answers, because I never dared to try it for myself. Chapter 60. Could Mr. Herriot see my dog, please? Familiar enough words coming from the waiting room, but it was the voice that brought me to a slithering halt just beyond the door. It couldn't be. No, of course it couldn't, but it sounded just like Helen. I tiptoed back and applied my eye without hesitation to the crack in the door. Tristan was standing there, looking down at somebody just beyond my range of vision. All I could see was a hand resting on the head of a patient sheepdog, the hem of a tweed skirt, and 2 silk-stockinged legs. They were nice legs, not skinny, and could easily belong to a big girl like Helen. My cogitations were cut short, as a head bent over to speak to the dog, and I had a close-up in profile of the small, straight nose and the dark hair falling across the milky smoothness of the cheek. I was still peering, bemused, when Tristan shot out of the room and collided with me. Stifling an oath, he grabbed my arm and hauled me along the passage into the dispensary. He shut the door and spoke in a hoarse whisper. "It's her! The Alderson woman, and she wants to see you! Not Siegfried, not me, but you, Mr. Herriot himself!" He looked at me wide-eyed for a few moments. Then, as I stood hesitating, he opened the door and tried to propel me into the passage. "What the hell are you waiting for?" he hissed. "Well, it's a bit embarrassing, isn't it? After that dance, I mean. Last time she saw me, I was a lovely sight. So pie-eyed I couldn't even speak." Tristan struck his forehead with his hand. "God help us! You worry about details, don't you? She's asked to see you. What more do you want? Go on, get in there." I was shuffling off irresolutely when he raised a hand. "Just a minute. Stay right there." He trotted off and returned in a few seconds, holding out a white lab coat. "Just back from the laundry," he said, and he began to work my arms into the starched sleeves. "You'll look marvellous in this, Jim. The immaculate young surgeon." I stood unresisting as he buttoned me into the garment, but struck away his hand when he started to straighten my tie. As I left him, he gave me a final encouraging wave before heading for the back stairs. I didn't give myself any more time to think, but marched straight into the waiting room. Helen looked up and smiled, and it was just the same smile. Nothing behind it, just the same friendly, steady-eyed smile as when I first met her. We faced each other in silence for a few moments. Then, when I didn't say anything, she looked down at the dog. "It's Dan in trouble this time," she said. "He's our sheepdog, but we're so fond of him that he's become more like one of the family." The dog wagged his tail furiously at the sound of his name, but yelped as he came towards me. I bent down and patted his head. "I see he's holding up a hind leg." "Yes, he jumped over a wall this morning and he's been like that ever since. I think it's something quite bad. He can't put any weight on the leg." "Right. Bring him through to the other room, would you? And I'll have a look at him. But take him in front of me, would you? And I'll be able to watch how he walks." I held the door open, and she went ahead of me with the dog. Watching how Helen walked distracted me over the first few yards, but it was a long passage, and by the time we'd reached the second bend, I had managed to drag my attention back to my patient. And glory be, it was a dislocated hip. It had to be with that shortening of the limb, and the way he carried it underneath his body with the paw just brushing the ground. Now my feelings were mixed. This was a major injury, but on the other hand, the chances were that I could put it right quickly and look good in the process. Because I had found in my brief experience that one of the most spectacular procedures in practice was the reduction of a dislocated hip. Maybe I had been lucky, but with the few I'd seen, I had been able to convert an alarmingly lame animal into a completely sound one as though by magic. In the operating room, I hoisted Dan onto the table. He stood without moving as I examined the hip. There was no doubt about it at all. The head of the femur was displaced upwards and backwards, plainly palpable under my thumb. The dog looked round only once, when I made a gentle attempt to flex the limb, but turned away immediately and stared resolutely ahead. His mouth hung open a little as he panted nervously, but like a lot of the placid animals which arrived at our surgery table, he seemed to have resigned himself to his fate. I had the strong impression that I could have started to cut his head off and he wouldn't have made much fuss. Good-natured dog, I said. And a bonny one, too. Helen patted the handsome head with the broad blaze of white down the face. The tail waved slowly from side to side. Yes, she said. He's just as much a family pet as a working dog. I do hope he hasn't hurt himself too badly. Well, he has a dislocated hip. It's a nasty thing, but with a bit of luck I ought to be able to put it back. What happens if it won't go back? Well, he'd have to form a false joint up there. He'd be very lame for several weeks and probably always have a slightly short leg. Oh dear, I wouldn't like that, Helen said. Do you think he'll be all right? I looked at the docile animal still gazing steadfastly to his front. I think he's got a good chance. Mainly because you haven't hung about for days before bringing him in. The sooner these things are tackled, the better. Oh, good. When will you be able to start on him? Well, right now. I went over to the door. I'll just give Tristan a shout. This is a two-man job. Well, couldn't I help? Helen said. I'd very much like to, if you wouldn't mind. I looked at her doubtfully. Well, I don't know. You mightn't like playing tug-of-war with Dan in the middle. He'll be anaesthetised, of course, but there's usually a lot of pulling. Helen laughed. Oh, I'm quite strong, and not a bit squeamish. I'm used to animals, you know, and I like working with them. Right, I said. Slip on this spare coat and we'll begin. The dog didn't flinch as I pushed the needle into his vein, and as the Nembutal flowed, his head began to slump against Helen's arm, and his supporting paw to slide along the smooth top of the table. Soon he was stretched unconscious on his side. I held the needle in the vein as I looked down at the sleeping animal. I might have to give him a bit more. They have to be pretty deep to overcome the muscular resistance. Another CC and Dan was as limp as any rag doll. I took hold of the affected leg and spoke across the table. I want you to link your hands underneath his thigh and try to hold him there when I pull. Okay? Here we go then. It takes a surprising amount of force to pull the head of a displaced femur over the rim of the acetabulum. I kept up a steady traction with my right hand, pressing on the head part of the femur at the same time with my left. Helen did her part efficiently, leaning back against the pull, her lips pushed forward in a little pout of concentration. I suppose there must be a foolproof way of doing this job, a method which works the very first time. I have never been able to find it. Success has always come to me only after a fairly long period of trial and error, and it was the same today. I tried all sorts of angles, rotations, and twists on the flaccid limb, trying not to think of how it would look if this just happened to be the one I couldn't put back. I was wondering what Helen, still hanging on determinedly to her end, must be thinking of this wrestling match when I heard the muffled click. It was a sweet and welcomed sound. I flexed the hip joint once or twice. No resistance at all now. The femoral head was once more riding smoothly in its socket. Well, that's it, I said. Hope it stays put. We'll have to keep our fingers crossed. The odd one does pop out again, but I've got a feeling this one's going to be all right. Helen ran her hand over the silky ears and neck of the sleeping dog. Poor old Dan. He wouldn't have jumped over that wall this morning if he'd known what was in store for him. How long will it be before he comes round? Oh, well, he'll be out for the rest of the day. When he starts to wake up tonight, I want you to be around to steady him in case he falls and puts the thing out again. Perhaps you'd give me a ring. I'd like to know how things are. I gathered Dan up in my arms, and I was carrying him along the passage, staggering under his weight, when I met Mrs. Hall. She was carrying a tray with 2 cups. I was just having a drink of tea, Mr. Herriot, she said. I thought you and the young lady might fancy a cup. I looked at her narrowly. This was unusual. Was it possible she'd joined Tristan in playing Cupid? But the broad, dark-skinned face was as unemotional as ever. It told me nothing. Well, thanks very much, Mrs. Hall. I'll just put this dog outside first." I went out and settled down on the back seat of Helen's car. With only his eyes and nose sticking out from under a blanket, he looked at peace with the world. Helen was already sitting with a cup in her lap, and I thought of the other time I'd drunk tea in this room with a girl, on the day I had arrived in Darrowby. She had been one of Siegfried's followers and surely the toughest of them all. This was a lot different. During the struggle in the operating room, I had been able to observe Helen at close range, and I had discovered that her mouth turned up markedly at the corners, as though she was just going to smile, or had just been smiling. Also that the deep, warm blue of the eyes under the smoothly arching brows made a dizzying partnership with the rich, black-brown of her hair. And this time the conversation didn't lag. Maybe it was because I was on my own ground. Perhaps I never really felt at ease unless there was a sick animal involved somewhere. But at any rate, I found myself prattling effortlessly just as I had done up on that hill when we'd first met. Mrs. Hall's teapot was empty and the last of the biscuits gone before I finally saw Helen off and started on my round. The same feeling of easy confidence was on me that night, when I heard her voice on the phone. "Dan is up and walking about," she said. "He's still a bit wobbly, but he's perfectly sound on that leg." "Oh, that's great. He's got the first stage over. I think everything's going to be fine." There was a pause at the other end of the line. Then, "Thank you so much for what you've done. We were terribly worried about him, especially my young brother and sister. We're very grateful." "Not at all. I'm delighted too. He's a grand dog." I hesitated for a moment. It had to be now. "Oh, you remember we were talking about Scotland today? Well, I was passing the plaza this afternoon and I see they're showing a film about the Hebrides. I thought I wondered if perhaps, well, you might like to come and see it with me." Another pause and my heart did a quick thud-thud. "All right," Helen said. "Yes, I'd like that." "When?" "Friday night." "Well, thank you. Goodbye till then." I replaced the receiver with a trembling hand. Why did I make such heavy weather of these things? But it didn't matter. I was back in business. Chapter 61. Rheumatism is a terrible thing in a dog. It is painful enough in humans, but an acute attack can reduce an otherwise healthy dog to terrified, screaming immobility. Very muscular animals suffered most, and I went carefully as my fingers explored the bulging triceps and gluteals of the little Staffordshire Bull Terrier. Normally a tough little fellow, afraid of nothing, friendly, leaping high in an attempt to lick people's faces, but today, rigid, trembling, staring anxiously in front of him. Even to turn his head a little brought a shrill howl of agony. Mercifully, it was something you could put right, and quickly too. I pulled the Novalgin into the syringe and injected it rapidly. The little dog, oblivious to everything but the knife-like stabbing of the rheumatism, did not stir at the prick of the needle. I counted out some salicylate tablets into a box, wrote the directions on the lid, and handed the box to the owner. "Give him one of these as soon as the injection has eased him, Mr. Taverner. Then repeat in about 4 hours. I'm pretty sure he'll be greatly improved by then." Mrs. Taverner snatched the box away as her husband began to read the directions. "Let me see it," she snapped. "No doubt I'll be the one who has the job to do." It had been like that all the time, ever since I'd entered the beautiful house with the terraced gardens leading down to the river. She had been at him ceaselessly while he was holding the dog for me. When the animal had yelped, she had cried, "Really, Henry, don't grip the poor thing like that. You're hurting him." She had kept him scuttling about for this and that, and then, when he was out of the room, she said, "You know, this is all my husband's fault. He will let that dog swim in the river. I knew this would happen." Halfway through, daughter Julia came in, and it was clear from the start that she was firmly on Mamma's side. She helped out with plenty of, "How could you, Daddy?" and "For God's sake, Daddy," and generally managed to fill in the gaps when her mother wasn't in full cry. The Taverners were in their 50s. He was a big, floridly handsome man who had made millions in the Tyneside shipyards before pulling out of the smoke to this lovely place. I had taken an instant liking to him. I had expected a tough tycoon and had found a warm, friendly, curiously vulnerable man, obviously worried sick about his dog. I had reservations about Mrs. Taverner, despite her still considerable beauty. Her smile had a switched-on quality, and there was a little too much steel in the blue of her eyes. She had seemed less concerned about the dog than with the necessity of taking it out on her husband. Julia, a scaled-down model of her mother, drifted about the room with the aimless, bored look of the spoilt child. Glancing blankly at the dog or me, staring without interest through the window at the smooth lawns, the tennis court, the dark band of river under the trees. I gave the terrier a final reassuring pat on the head and got up from my knees. As I put away the syringe, Taverner took my arm. "Well, that's fine, Mr. Herriot. We're very grateful to you for relieving our minds. I must say I thought the old boy's time had come when he started yelling. And now, you'll have a drink before you go." The man's hand trembled on my arm as he spoke. It had been noticeable, too, when he had been holding the dog's head, and I had wondered, maybe Parkinson's disease, or nerves, or just drink. Certainly he was pouring a generous measure of whiskey into his glass, but as he tipped up the bottle, his hand was seized by an even more violent tremor, and he slopped the spirit onto the polished sideboard. "Oh, God! Oh, God!" Mrs. Taverner burst out. There was a bitter note of, oh, not again, in her cry, and Julia struck her forehead with her hand and raised her eyes to heaven. Taverner shot a single hunted look at the woman, then grinned as he handed me my glass. "Come and sit down, Mr. Herriot," he said. "I'm sure you have time to relax for a few minutes." We moved over to the far side, and Taverner talked pleasantly about dogs and the countryside and the pictures which hung on the walls of the big room. Those pictures were noted in the district. Many of them were originals by famous painters, and they had become the main interest in Taverner's life. His other passion was clocks, and as I looked round the room at the rare and beautiful timepieces standing among elegant period furniture, it was easy to believe the rumours I'd heard about the wealth within these walls. The women did not drink with us. They had disappeared when the whiskey was brought out. But as I drained my glass, the door was pushed open, and they stood there looking remarkably alike in expensive tweed coats and fur-trimmed hats. Mrs. Taverner, pulling on a pair of motoring gloves, looked with distaste at her husband. "We're going into Broughton," she said. "Don't know when we'll be back." Behind her, Julia stared coldly at her father. Her lip curled slightly. Taverner did not reply. He sat motionless as I listened to the roar of the car engine and the spatter of whipped-up gravel beyond the window. Then he looked out, blank-faced, empty-eyed, at the drifting cloud of exhaust smoke in the drive. There was something in his expression which chilled me. I put down my glass and got to my feet. "Afraid I must be moving on, Mr. Taverner. Thanks for the drink." He seemed suddenly to be aware of my presence. The friendly smile returned. "Not at all. Thank you for looking after the old boy. He seems better already." In the driving mirror, the figure at the top of the steps looked small and alone, till the high shrubbery hid him from my view. The next call was to a sick pig high on Marstang Fell. The road took me at first along a fertile valley floor, winding under the riverside trees past substantial farmhouses and rich pastures. But as the car left the road and headed up a steep track, the country began to change. The transition was almost violent as the trees and the bushes thinned out and gave way to the bare, rocky hillside and the miles of limestone walls. And though the valley had been rich with the fresh green of the new leaves, up here the buds were unopened, and the naked branches stretched against the sky still had the look of winter. Tim Alton's farm lay at the top of the track, and as I pulled up at the gate I wondered, as I always did, how the man could scrape a living from those few harsh acres with the grass flattened and yellowed by the wind which always blew. At any rate, many generations had accomplished the miracle, and had lived and struggled and died in that house, with its outbuildings crouching in the lee of a group of stunted, wind-bent trees, its massive stones crumbling under 3 centuries of fierce weathering. Why should anybody want to build a farm in such a place? I turned as I opened the gate and looked back at the track, threading between the walls, down and down, to where the white stones of the river glittered in the spring sunshine. Maybe the builder had stood here and looked across the green vastness and breathed in the cold, sweet air and thought it was enough. I saw Tim Alton coming across the yard. There had been no need to lay down concrete or cobbles here. They had just swept away the thin soil, and there, between house and building, was a sloping stretch of fissured rock. It was more than a durable surface. It was everlasting. "It's your pig this time then, Tim?" I said, and the farmer nodded seriously. "Aye, right as out yesterday and laid flat like a dead one this morning. Never looked up when I filled his trough, and by go, when a pig won't tackle his grub, there's somewhat far wrong." Tim dug his hands inside the broad leather belt which encircled his oversized trousers, and which always seemed to be about to nip his narrow frame in two, and led the way gloomily into the sty. Despite the bitter poverty of his existence, he was a man who took misfortune cheerfully. I had never seen him look like this, and I thought I knew the reason. There is something personal about the family pig. Smallholders like Tim Alton made their meagre living from a few cows. They sold their milk to the big dairies or made butter. And they killed a pig or two each year and cured it themselves for home consumption. On the poorer places, it seemed to me that they ate little else. Whatever meal I happened to stumble in on, the cooking smell was always the same: roasting fat bacon. It appeared to be a matter of pride to make the pig as fat as possible. In fact, on those little wind-blown farms where the people and the cows and the dogs were lean and spare, the pig was about the only fat thing to be seen. I had seen the Alton pig before. I had been stitching a cow's torn teat about a fortnight ago, and Tim had patted me on the shoulder and whispered, "Now come along with me, Mr. Herriot, and I'll show you summat." We had looked into the sty at a 25-stone monster, effortlessly emptying a huge trough of wet meal. I could remember the pride in the farmer's eyes, and the way he listened to the smacking and slobbering as if to great music. It was different today. The pig looked, if possible, even more enormous as it lay on its side, eyes closed, filling the entire floor of the sty like a beached whale. Tim splashed a stick among the untouched meal in the trough and made encouraging noises, but the animal never stirred. The farmer looked at me with haggard eyes. "He's bad, Mr. Herriot. It's serious, whatever it is." I had been taking the temperature, and when I read the thermometer, I whistled. 107. That's some fever. The colour drained from Tim's face. "Oh, hell. 107? Well, it's hopeless, then." "It's hour with him." I had been feeling along the animal's side, and I smiled reassuringly. "No, don't worry, Tim. I think he's going to be all right. He's got erysipelas. Here, put your finger along his back. Now, you can feel a lot of flat swellings on his skin. Well, those are the diamonds. He'll have a beautiful rash within a few hours, but at the moment you can't see it. You can only feel it. And you can make him better." "Well, I'm nearly sure I can. I'll give him a whacking dose of serum. And I'd like to bet that he'll have his nose in that trough in a couple of days. Most of them get over it all right." "Well, that's a bit of good news, any road," said Tim, a smile flooding over his face. "You have me worried there with your 107, dang you." I laughed. "Yeah, sorry, Tim. I didn't mean to frighten you. I'm often happy to see a high temperature than a low one." "But it's a funny time for erysipelas. We usually see that in late summer." "All right, I'll let you off this time. Come in and wash your hands." In the kitchen I ducked my head, but couldn't avoid bumping the massive side of bacon hanging from the beamed ceiling. The heavy mass rocked gently on its hooks. It was about 8 inches thick in parts, all pure white fat. Only by close inspection was it possible to discern a thin strip of lean meat. Mrs. Alton produced a cup of tea, and as I sipped, I looked across at Tim, who had fallen back into a chair and lay there with his hands hanging down. For a moment he closed his eyes, and his face became a mask of weariness. I thought for the 100th time about the endless labour which made up the lives of these little farmers. Alton was only 40, but his body was already bent and ravaged by the constant demands he made on it. You could read his story on the corded forearm, the rough, work-swollen fingers. He told me once that the last time he missed a milking was 12 years ago, and that was for his father's funeral. I was taking my leave and I saw Jenny. She was the Altons' eldest child, and was pumping vigorously at the tire of a bicycle which was leaning against the wall just outside the kitchen door. "Going somewhere?" I asked, and the girl straightened up quickly, pushing back a few strands of dark hair from her forehead. She was about 18, with delicate features and large, expressive eyes. In her wild, pinched prettiness, there was something of the wheeling curlews, the wind and the sun, the wide emptiness of the moors. "I'm going down to the village." She stole a glance into the kitchen. "I'm going to get a bottle of Guinness for my dad." "The village? That's a long way to go for a bottle of Guinness." "It must be 2 miles. And then you've got to push back up this hill. Are you going all that way just for one bottle?" "Aye, just one," she whispered, counting out a sixpence and some coppers into her palm with calm absorption. "Dad's been up all night waiting for a heifer to calve. He's tired out. I won't be long, and he can have his Guinness with his dinner. That's what he likes." She looked up at me conspiratorially. "It'll be a surprise for him." As she spoke, her father, still sprawled in the chair, turned his head and looked at her. He smiled, and for a moment I saw a serenity in the steady eyes, a nobility in the seamed face. Jenny looked at him for a few seconds, a happy, secret look from under her lowered brows. Then she turned quickly, mounted her bicycle, and began to pedal down the track at surprising speed. I followed her more slowly, the car in second gear, bumping and swaying over the stones. I stared straight ahead, lost in thought. I couldn't stop my mind roaming between the 2 houses I'd visited, between the gracious mansion by the river and the crumbling farmhouse I'd just left. From Henry Taverner, with his beautiful clothes, his well-kept hands, his rows of books and pictures and clocks, to Tim Alton with his worn, chest-high trousers nipped in by that great belt, his daily, monthly, yearly grind to stay alive on that unrelenting hilltop. But I kept coming back to the daughters, to the contempt in Julia Taverner's eyes when she looked at her father, and the shining tenderness in Jenny Alton's. It wasn't so easy to work out as it seemed. In fact, it became increasingly difficult to decide who was getting the most out of their different lives. But as I guided the car over the last few yards of the track and pulled onto the smooth tarmac of the road, it came to me with unexpected clarity. Taking it all in all, if I had the choice to make, I'd settle for the Guinness. Chapter 62. Tristan was unpacking the UCMs. These bottles contained a rich red fluid which constituted our last line of defense in the battle with animal disease. Its full name, Universal Cattle Medicine, was proclaimed on the label in big black type, and underneath it pointed out that it was highly efficacious for coughs, chills, scours, garget, milk fever, pneumonia, felon, and bloat. It finished off on a confident note, with the assurance, "never fails to give relief." And we had read the label so often that we half believed it. It was a pity it didn't do any good, because there was something compelling about its ruby depths when you held it up to the light, and about the solid camphor ammonia jolt when you sniffed at it, and which made the farmers blink and shake their heads and say, "By God, that's powerful stuff," with deep respect. But our specific remedies were so few and the possibilities of error so plentiful that it was comforting in cases of doubt to be able to hand over a bottle of the old standby. Whenever an entry of Siegfried's or mine appeared in the daybook stating, "Visit attend cow, advice 1 UCM," it was a pretty fair bet we didn't know what was wrong with the animal. The bottles were tall and shapely, and they came in elegant white cartons, so much more impressive than the unobtrusive containers of the antibiotics and steroids which we use today. Tristan was lifting them out of the tea chest and stacking them on the shelves in deep rows. When he saw me, he ceased his labours, sat on the chest and pulled out a packet of Woodbines. He lit one, pulled the smoke a long way down, then fixed me with a non-committal stare. "You're taking her to the pictures, then?" Feeling vaguely uneasy under his eye, I tipped a pocketful of assorted empties into a wastebasket. "Yes, that's right. In about an hour." He narrowed his eyes against the slowly escaping smoke. "Oh, I see." "Well, what are you looking like that for?" I said defensively. "Anything wrong with going to the pictures?" No, nothing at all, Jim, nothing. A very wholesome pursuit." "But you don't think I should be taking Helen there?" "Well, I never said that. No, I'm sure you will have a very nice time. It's just that—" He scratched his head. "I thought you might have gone in for something a bit more, well, enterprising." I gave a bitter laugh. "Ha, look! I tried enterprise at the Reniston. Look, I'm not blaming you, Tris. You meant well. But as you know, it was a complete shambles. I just don't want anything to go wrong tonight. I'm playing safe." "Well, I won't argue with you there," Tristan said. "You couldn't get much safer than the Darrowby Plaza." And later, shivering in the tub in the vast, draughty bathroom, I couldn't keep out the thought that Tristan was right. Taking Helen to the local cinema was a form of cowardice. A shrinking away from reality into what I hoped would be safe, dark intimacy. But as I towelled myself, hopping about to keep warm, and looking out through the fringe of wisteria in the darkening garden, there was comfort in the thought that it was another beginning, even though a small one. And as I closed the door of Skeldale House and looked along the street to where the first lights of the shops beckoned in the dusk, I felt a lifting of the heart. It was as though a breath from the nearby hills had touched me. A fleeting fragrance which said winter had gone. It was still cold. Well, it was always cold in Darrowby until well into May. But the promise was there, of sunshine and warm grass and softer days. You have to look closely, or you could easily miss the plaza, tucked as it was between Piggerskills the ironmonger's and Howarth's the chemist. There had never been much attempt at grandeur in its architecture, and the entrance was hardly wider than the average shop front. But what puzzled me as I approached was that the place was in darkness. I was in good time, but the show was due to start in 10 minutes or so, and there was no sign of life. I hadn't dared tell Tristan that my precautions had extended as far as arranging to meet Helen here. With a car like mine, there was always an element of doubt about arriving anywhere in time, or indeed at all, and I thought it prudent to eliminate all transport hazards. Meet you outside the cinema. My God, it wasn't very bright, was it? It took me back to my childhood, to the very first time I had taken a girl out. I was just 14, and on my way to meet her, I tendered my only half-crown to a bloody-minded Glasgow tram conductor and asked him for a penny fare. He vented his spleen on me by ransacking his bag and giving me my change entirely in halfpennies. So, when the cinema queue reached the pay box, I had to stand there with my little partner and everybody else watching, while I paid for our shilling tickets with great handfuls of copper. The shame of it left a scar. It was another 4 years before I took out a girl again. But the black thoughts were dispelled when I saw Helen picking her way across the marketplace cobbles. She smiled and waved cheerfully to me as if being taken to the Darrowby was the biggest treat a girl could wish for. And when she came right up to me, there was a soft flush on her cheeks and her eyes were bright. Everything was suddenly absolutely right. I felt a surging conviction that this was going to be a good night. Nothing was going to spoil it. After we had said hello, she told me that Dan was running about like a puppy with no trace of a limp, and the news was another wave on the high tide of my euphoria. The only thing that troubled me was the blank, uninhabited appearance of the cinema entrance. "Strange there's nobody here," I said. "It's nearly starting time. I suppose the place is open." "Must be," said Helen. "It's open every night but Sunday. Anyway, I'm sure these people are waiting too." I looked round. There was no queue as such, but little groups were standing here and there. A few couples, mostly middle-aged, a bunch of small boys rolling and fighting on the pavement. Nobody seemed worried. And indeed, there was no cause. Exactly 2 minutes before the picture was due to start, a figure in a Macintosh coat pedalled furiously round the corner of the street, head down, legs pistoning, the bicycle lying over at a perilous angle with the ground. He came to a screeching halt outside the entrance, inserted a key in the lock and threw wide the doors. Reaching inside, he flicked a switch, and a single neon strip flickered fitfully above our heads and went out. He did this a few times, and it seemed bent on mischief till he stood on tiptoe and beat it into submission with a masterful blow of his fist. Then he whipped off the mackintosh, revealing faultless evening dress. The manager had arrived. While this was going on, a very fat lady appeared from nowhere and wedged herself into the pay box. The show was ready to roll. We all began to shuffle inside. The little boys put down their ninepences and punched each other as they passed through the curtain into the stalls, while the rest of us proceeded decorously upstairs to the 1 and 6penny seats in the balcony. The manager, his white shirt front and silk lapels gleaming, smiled and bowed with great courtesy as we passed. We paused at a row of pegs at the top of the stairs while some people hung up their coats. I was surprised to see Maggie Robinson, the blacksmith's daughter, there, taking the tickets, and she appeared to be intrigued by the sight of us. She simpered and giggled, darted glances at Helen, and did everything but dig me in the ribs. Finally, she parted the curtain, and we went inside. It struck me immediately that the management were determined that their patrons wouldn't feel cold, because if it hadn't been for the all-pervading smell of old sofas, we might have been plunging into a tropical jungle. Maggie steered us through the stifling heat to our places, and as I sat down, I noticed there was no arm between the two seats. "Them's the courting seats," she blurted out, and fled with her hand to her mouth. The lights were still on, and I looked around the tiny balcony. There were only about a dozen people, dotted here and there, sitting in patient silence under the plain, distempered walls. By the side of the screen, the hands of a clock stood resolutely at 4:20. But he was all right sitting there with Helen. I felt fine, except for a tendency to gasp like a goldfish in the airless atmosphere. I was settling down cosily when a little man seated in front of us with his wife turned round slowly. The mouth in the haggard face was pursed grimly, and he fixed his eyes on mine in a long, challenging stare. We faced each other for several silent moments before he finally spoke. "She's dead," he said. A thrill of horror shot through me. "Dead?" "Aye, she is. She's dead." He dragged the word out slowly with a kind of mournful satisfaction, while his eyes still stared into mine. I swallowed a couple of times. "Well, I'm sorry to hear that. I'm truly sorry." He nodded grimly and continued to regard me with a peculiar intensity, as though he expected me to say more. Then, with apparent reluctance, he turned away and settled in his seat. I looked helplessly at the rigid back, at the square, narrow shoulders muffled in a heavy overcoat. Who in God's name was this? And what was he talking about? I knew the face from somewhere. It must be a client. And what was dead? Cow? Ewe? Sow? My mind began to race over the cases I had seen during the past week, but that face didn't seem to fit in anywhere. Helen was looking at me questioningly, and I managed a wan smile. But the spell was shattered. I started to say something to her when the little man began to turn again with menacing deliberation. He fixed me once more with a hostile glare. "I don't think there was ever aught wrong with her stomach," he declared. "Oh, you don't, eh?" "No, young man, I don't." He dragged his eyes unwillingly from my face and turned towards the screen again. The effect of this second attack was highlighted because the lights went off suddenly and an incredible explosion of noise blasted my eardrums. It was the Gaumont News. The sound machine, like the heating system, had apparently been designed for something like the Albert Hall, and for a moment I cowered back under the assault. As a voice bellowed the details of fortnight-old events, I closed my eyes and tried again to place the man in front of me. I often had trouble identifying people outside their usual environment, and had once discussed the problem with Siegfried. He had been airy. "Well, there's an easy way, James. Just ask them how they spell their names. You'll have no trouble at all." I had tried this on one occasion, and the farmer had looked at me strangely and replied, "S-M-I-T-H," and hurried away. So there seemed nothing to do now but sit sweating with my eyes on the disapproving back and search through my memory. When the news finished with a raucous burst of music, I had got back about 3 weeks without result. There was a blessed respite for a few seconds before the uproar broke out again. This was the main feature. The film about Scotland was on later, and was described outside as a tender love story. I can't remember the title, but there was a lot of embracing, which would have been all right, except that every kiss was accompanied by a chorus of long-drawn sucking noises from the little boys downstairs. The less romantic, blue raspberries. And all the time, it got hotter. I opened my jacket wide and unbuttoned my shirt collar, but I was beginning to feel decidedly light-headed. The little man in front, still huddled in his heavy overcoat, seemed unperturbed. Twice the projector broke down, and we stared for several minutes at a blank screen while a storm of whistling and stamping came up from the stalls. Maggie Robinson, standing in the dim light by the curtain, still appeared to be fascinated by the sight of Helen and me. Whenever I looked up, I found her eyes fixed upon us with a knowing leer. About halfway through the film, however, her concentration was disturbed by a commotion on the other side of the curtain, and she was suddenly brushed aside as a large form burst through. With a feeling of disbelief, I recognized Gobber Newhouse. I had had previous experience of his disregard of the licensing laws, and it was clear he'd been at it again. He spent most afternoons in the back rooms of the local pubs, and here he was, come to relax after a rough session. He reeled up the aisle, turned, to my dismay, into our row, rested briefly on Helen's lap, trod on my toe, and finally spread his enormous carcass over the seat on my left. Fortunately, it was another courting seat with no central arm to get in his way, but for all that he had great difficulty in finding a comfortable position. He heaved and squirmed about, and the wheezing and snuffling and grunting in the darkness might have come from a pen of bacon pigs. But at last he found a spot, and with a final cavernous belch, composed himself for slumber. The tender love story never did have much of a chance, but Gobber sounded its death knell. With his snores reverberating in my ear, and a dense pall of stale beer drifting over me, I was unable to appreciate any of the delicate nuances. It was a relief when the last close-up came to an end and the lights went up. I was a bit worried about Helen. I had noticed as the evening wore on that her lips had a tendency to twitch occasionally, and now and then she drew her brows down in a deep frown. I wondered if she was upset, but Maggie appeared providentially with a tray round her neck and stood over us, still leering, while I purchased 2 chocolate ices. I had taken only one bite when I noticed a stirring under the overcoat in front of me. The little man was returning to the attack. The eyes staring from the grim mask were as chilling as ever. "I knew," he said, "right from the start that you were on the wrong track." "Oh, is that so?" "Aye, I've been among beasts for 50 years, and they never go on like that when it's the stomach." "Don't they?" "Well, you're probably right." The little man twisted higher in his seat, and for a moment I thought he was going to climb over at me. He raised a forefinger. "For one thing, a beast with a bad stomach is allus hard in its muck." "Oh, I see." "And if you think back, this one's muck was soft. Real soft." Yes, quite," I said hastily, glancing across at Helen. This was great. Just what I needed to complete the romantic atmosphere. He sniffed and turned away, and once again, as if the whole thing had been stage-managed, we were plunged into blackness and the noise blasted out again. I was lying back, quivering, when it came through to me that something was wrong. What was this strident Western music? Then the title flashed on the screen. Arizona Guns. I turned to Helen in alarm. What's going on? This is supposed to be the Scottish film, isn't it? The one we came to see?" "It's supposed to be," Helen paused, and looked at me with a half-smile. "But I'm afraid it isn't going to be. The thing is, they often change the supporting film without warning. Nobody seems to mind." I slumped wearily in my seat. Well, I had done it again. No dance at the Reniston, wrong picture tonight. I was a genius in my own way. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said. "Hope you don't mind too much." She shook her head. Not a bit. Anyway, let's give this one a chance. It may be all right. But as the ancient horse opera crackled out its cliché-ridden message, I gave up hope. This was going to be another of those evenings. I watched apathetically as the posse galloped for the fourth time past the same piece of rock, and I was totally unprepared for the deafening fusillade of shots which rang out. It made me jump, and it even roused Gobber from his sleep. "Hello, hello, hello!" he bawled, jerking upright and thrashing around him with his arms. A backhander on the side of the head drove me violently against Helen's shoulder, and I was beginning to apologize when I saw that her twitching and frowning had come on again. But this time, it spread, and her whole face seemed to break up. She began to laugh, silently and helplessly. I had never seen a girl laugh like this. It was as though it was something she had wanted to do for a long time. She abandoned herself utterly to it, lying back with her head on the back of the seat, legs stretched out in front of her, arms dangling by her side. She took her time and waited until she had got it all out of her system before she turned to me. She put her hand on my arm. "Look," she said faintly. "Next time, why don't we just go for a walk?" I settled down. Gobber was asleep again, and his snores, louder than ever, competed with the bangs and howls from the screen. I still hadn't the slightest idea who that little man in front of me could be, and I had the feeling he wasn't finished with me yet. The clock still stood at 4:20. Maggie was still staring at us, and a steady trickle of sweat ran down my back. The environment wasn't all I could have desired, but never mind. There was going to be a next time. Chapter 63. Siegfried had a habit of pulling at the lobe of his ear and staring blankly ahead when preoccupied. He was doing it now, his other hand outstretched, crumbling a crust of bread on his plate. I didn't usually pry into my boss's meditations, and anyway I wanted to be off on the morning round. But there was something portentous in his face which made me speak. "What's the matter? Something on your mind?" Siegfried turned his head slowly and his eyes glared sightlessly for a few moments, until recognition dawned. He stopped his lobe pulling, got to his feet, walked over to the window, and looked out at the empty street. "There is, James. There is indeed. In fact, I was just about to ask your advice. It's about this letter I got this morning." He ransacked his pockets impatiently, pulled out handkerchiefs, thermometers, crumpled back notes, list of calls, till he found a long blue envelope. "Ah, here. Read it." I opened the envelope and quickly scanned the single sheet. I looked up, puzzled. "I'm sorry, I don't get it. All it says here is that H.W. St. J. Ransom, Major General, would like the pleasure of your company at Broughton Races on Saturday." Well, there's no problem there, is there? You like racing. "Ah, but it's not as simple as that," Siegfried said, starting again on the lobe. "This is in the nature of a trial. General Ransom is one of the big boys in the Northwest racing circuit, and he's bringing one of his pals along on Saturday to vet me. They're going to examine me for soundness." I must have looked alarmed because he grinned. "Look, I'd better start at the beginning, and I'll cut it short. The officials of the Northwest Circuit are looking for a veterinary surgeon to supervise all meetings. You know the local man attends if there's a racecourse in his town, and he is on call in case of injury to the horses. But this will be different. This supervisory vet would deal with cases of suspected doping and the like. In fact, he'd have to be a bit of a specialist. Well, I've had a whisper that they think I might be the man for the job, and that's what Saturday's about. I know old Ransom, but I haven't met his colleague. See, the idea is to have a day at the races with me and size me up." "Well, if you got the job, would it mean giving up general practice?" I asked. And a chill wind seemed to creep round me at the idea. No, but it would mean spending something like 3 days a week on a racecourse. And I'm wondering if that wouldn't be just a bit much." "Well, I don't know." I finished my coffee and pushed back my chair. "I'm not really the one to advise you on this, you know. I haven't had a lot of experience with racehorses, and I'm not interested in racing. You'll have to make up your own mind. But you've often talked of specialising in horsework, and you love the atmosphere of a racecourse, don't you?" "Yes, you're right there, James, I do." and there's no doubt the extra money would come in very useful. It's what every practice needs, a contract of some sort, a regular income from somewhere to make you less dependent on the farmers paying their bills, huh? He turned away from the window. Anyway, I'll go to Broughton races with them on Saturday, and we'll see how it turns out. And you must come too. Me? Why? Well, it says in the letter, and partner. That means some woman. They'll have their wives with them, no doubt. Look, doesn't matter what it means, James, you're coming with me. A day out and a bit of free food and booze will do you good. Tristan can hold the fort for a few hours. It was nearly noon on Saturday when I answered the doorbell. As I walked along the passage, it was easy to identify the people beyond the glass door. General Ransom was short and square, with a moustache of surprising blackness, thrusting aggressively from his upper lip. Colonel Tremaine was tall, hawk-nosed and stooping, but he shared with his companion the almost tangible aura of authority which comes from a lifetime of command. Two tweedy women stood behind them on the lower step. I opened the door, feeling my shoulders squaring and my heels coming together under the battery of fierce, unsmiling glares. "Mr. Farnon?" barked the General. "Expecting us, I think." I retreated a pace and opened the door. "Oh, yes, certainly. Please come in." The two women swept in first. Mrs. Ransom was squat and chunky, and even tougher looking than her husband. Then Mrs. Tremaine, much younger and attractive in a hard-boiled fashion. All of them completely ignored me except the Colonel, who brought up the rear and fixed me for a moment with a fishy eye. I had been instructed to dispense sherry, and once inside the sitting room, I began to pour from a decanter. I was halfway up the second glass when Siegfried walked in. I spilt some of the sherry. My boss had really spruced up for the occasion. His lean frame was draped in cavalry twill of flawless cut. The long, strong-boned face was freshly shaven, the small, sandy moustache neatly clipped. He swept off a brand-new bowler as he came in, and I put down my decanter and gazed at him with proprietary pride. Maybe there had been a few dukes or the odd earl in Siegfried's family tree, but be that as it may, the two army men seemed, in an instant, to become low-bred and a trifle scruffy. There was something almost ingratiating in the way the General went up to Siegfried. "Farnon, my dear fellow, how are you? Good to see you again. Let me introduce you to my wife, Mrs. Tremaine, Colonel Tremaine." The Colonel, astonishingly, dug up a twisted smile, but my main interest was the reaction of the ladies. Mrs. Ransom, looking up at Siegfried as he bent over her, just went to pieces. It was unbelievable that this formidable fortress should crumble at the first shot, but there it was. The tough lines melted from her face, and she was left with a big, sloppy smile looking like anybody's dear old mum. Mrs. Tremaine's response was different but no less dramatic. As the steady grey eyes swept her, she seemed to wither, and it was as if a spasm of exquisite pain twisted her cheeks. She controlled herself with an effort, but looked after Siegfried with wistful hunger as he turned back to the men. I began to slosh the sherry violently into the glasses. Damn it, there it was again. The same old thing, and yet he didn't do anything. Just looked at them. Hell, it wasn't fair. Sherry over, we moved outside and installed ourselves in Siegfried's Rover, on which an immaculate coach-building job had been done since the disaster of last summer. It was an impressive turnout. The car, after a morning's forced labour by Tristan with hose and leather, shone like a mirror. Siegfried, in the driver's seat, extended an elegant arm to his brother as we drove away. I couldn't help feeling that the only superfluous object was myself, squatting uncomfortably on the little let-down seat, facing the two army men who sat to attention in the back seat, their bowlers pointing rigidly to the front. Between them, Mrs. Tremaine stared wonderingly at the back of Siegfried's head. We lunched on the course. Siegfried comfortably at home with the smoked salmon, the cold chicken, and the champagne. There was no doubt he had scored a tremendous success during the meal, discussing racing knowledgeably with the men and dispensing charm equally to their wives. The tough Mrs. Ransom positively simpered as he marked her card for her. It was quite certain that if the new appointment hung upon his behaviour today, a vote at this time would have seen him home and dry. After lunch, we went down to the paddock and had a look at the horses parading for the first race. I could see Siegfried expanding as he took in the scene. The jostling crowds, the shouting bookies, the beautiful animals pacing round, the jockeys, tiny, colourful, durable, chatting to the trainers out in the middle. He had got through enough champagne at lunch to sharpen his appreciation, and he was the very picture of a man who just knew he was going to have a successful day. Merryweather, the course vet, joined us to watch the first race. Siegfried knew him slightly, and they were chatting after the race when the vet wanted sign went up. A man hurried up to Merryweather. "That horse that slipped at the last bend is still down and doesn't look like getting up." The vet started for his car, which was parked in readiness near the rails. He turned towards us. "You two want to come?" Siegfried looked inquiringly at his party and received gracious nods of assent. We hurried after our colleague. Within seconds we were racing down the course towards the last bend. Merryweather, hanging onto the wheel as we sped over the grass, grunted half to himself. "Hell, I hope this hasn't got a fracture. If there's one thing I mortally hate, it's shooting a horse." It didn't look good when we got to the spot. The sleek animal lay flat on its side, showing no movement apart from the laboured rise and fall of its ribs. The jockey, blood streaming from a cut brow, knelt by his head. "What do you think, sir? Has he a broken leg?" "Let's have a look." Merryweather began to palpate the extended limbs, running strong fingers over one bone, then another, carefully flexing the joints of fetlock, knee, shoulder, hock. Nothing wrong there. Well, certainly no fracture. Then he pointed suddenly at the head. "Look at his eyes." We looked. They were glazed, and there was a slight but unmistakable nystagmus. "Concussion," Siegfried said. "That's it. He's just had a bang on the head." Merryweather got off his knees, looking happier. "Come on, we'll push him onto his chest. I think he ought to be able to get up with a bit of help." There were plenty of helpers from the crowd, and the horse was rolled easily till he rested on his sternum, forelegs extended forward. After a couple of minutes in this position, he struggled to his feet and stood swaying slightly. A stable lad walked him away. Merryweather laughed. "Well, that wasn't so bad. Good horse, that. I think he'll be all right after a rest." Siegfried had started to reply when he heard "Psst! Psst!" from beyond the rails. He looked up and saw a stout, red-faced figure gesturing at us eagerly. "Hey! Hey!" it was saying. "Come over here a minute." We went over. There was something about the face which Siegfried seemed to find intriguing. He looked closer at the pudgy, grinning features, the locks of oily black hair falling over the brow, and he cried out in delight. "God help us, Stewie Brannan! James, come and meet another colleague. We came through college together." Siegfried had told me a lot about Stewie Brannan. So much, in fact, that I seemed to be shaking hands with an old, well-remembered friend. Sometimes, when the mood was on us, Siegfried and I would sit up nearly till dawn over a bottle in the big room at Skeldale House, chewing over old times and recalling the colourful characters we'd known. I remembered he had told me he had overtaken Stewie about halfway through the course and had qualified while Stewie was still battling in his third year. Siegfried had described him as totally unambitious, averse to study, disinclined to wash or shave, in fact, his idea of the young man least likely to succeed. But there had been something touching about him. The ingenuousness of a child, a huge, all-embracing affection for his fellow humans, an impregnable cheerfulness. Siegfried called over to Merryweather. "Will you give my apologies to my friends when you go back? There's a chap here I have to see. I'll only be a few minutes." Merryweather waved, got into his car, and drove back up the course as we ducked under the rails. Siegfried seized the bulky figure by the arm. "Come on, Stewie. Where can we get a drink?" Chapter 64. We went into a long, low bar under the stand, and I experienced a slight shock of surprise. This was the 4 and 6penny end, and the amenities were rather different from the paddock. The eating and drinking was done mainly in the vertical position, and the cuisine seemed to consist largely of pies and sausage rolls. Siegfried fought his way to the bar and collected 3 whiskies. We sat down at one of the few available tables, an unstable metal-topped structure. At the next table, a sharp-faced character studied the pinken, while he took great swigs at a pint and tore savagely at a pork pie. "Now, my lad," Siegfried said, "what have you been doing for the past 6 years?" "Well, sir, let's see," said Stewie, absently downing his whisky at a gulp. "I got into finals shortly after you left, and I didn't go so bad at all, really. Pipped them both first go. But then, I had a bit of bother with surgery a couple of times, but I was launched on the unsuspecting animal population 4 years ago, yes, sir. I've been around quite a bit since then. North, south, even 6 months in Ireland. I've been trying to find a place with a living wage, you know. This 3 or 4 quid a week lark isn't much cop when you have a family to keep." "Family? You're married then?" "Not half. You remember little Meg Hamilton? I used to bring her to the college dances. We got married when I got into the final year. We've got 5 kids now, and another on the way." Siegfried choked on his whisky. 5 kids? Oh, for God's sake, Stewie! "Ah, it's wonderful, really, Siegfried. You wouldn't wonder how we managed to exist." "Well, I couldn't tell you. I don't know myself. But we've kept one jump ahead of ruin, and we've been happy too. I think we're going to be okay now. I stuck up my plate in Hensfield a few months ago, and I'm doing all right. Been able to clear the housekeeping, and that's all that matters." "Hensfield, eh?" Siegfried said. I pictured the grim West Riding town. A wilderness of decaying brick, bristling with factory chimneys. It was the other Yorkshire. "Mainly small animals, I suppose." "Oh, yes. Yes. I earn my daily bread almost entirely by separating the local tomcats from their knackers, you know. Thanks to me, the feline females of Hensfield can walk the streets unmolested." Siegfried laughed, and caught the only waitress in the place lightly by the arm as she hurried by. She whipped round with a frown and an angry word, but took another look and smiled. "Yes, sir?" Siegfried looked into her face seriously for a few moments, still holding her arm. Then he spoke, quietly. "I wonder if you'd be kind enough to bring us 3 large whiskies, and keep repeating the order whenever you see our glasses are empty. Would you be able to do that?" "Certainly, sir. Of course." The waitress was over 40, but she was blushing like a young girl. Stewie's chins quivered with silent laughter. "You old bugger, Farnon. It does me good to see you haven't changed." "Really? Well, that's rather nice, isn't it? And the funny thing is, I don't think you really try." "Try? Well, try what?" "Ah, nothing. Forget it. Here's our whiskey." As the drinks kept coming, they talked and talked. I didn't butt in. I sat, listening, wrapped in a pleasant euphoria, and pushing every other glassful unobtrusively round to Stewie, who put it out of sight with a careless jerk of the wrist. As Siegfried sketched out his own progress, I was struck by the big man's total absence of envy. He was delighted to hear about the rising practice, the pleasant house, the assistant. Siegfried had described him as plump in the old days, but he was fat now, despite his hard times. And I had heard about that overcoat. It was the navy nap, which had been his only protection through the years at college. It couldn't have looked so good then, but it was a sad thing now, the seams straining to bursting by the bulging flesh. "Look, Stewie!" Siegfried fumbled uncomfortably with his glass. "Look, I'm sure you're going to do well in Hensfield, but if by some mischance things get a bit rough, I hope you wouldn't hesitate to turn to me. I'm not so far off in Darrowby, you know. In fact—" He paused and swallowed. "Are you all right now? I mean, if a few quid would help. I mean, I've got them here, and—" Stewie tossed back what must have been the 10th double whiskey, and gazed at his old friend with gentle benevolence. "You're a kind old bugger, Siegfried, but no thanks. As I said, we're clearing the housekeeping and we'll be okay. But I appreciate it. You always were kind. A strange old bugger, but kind." "Strange?" Siegfried was interested. "No, not strange. Wrong word. Different. That's it. You were as different as hell." "Different?" queried Siegfried, swallowing his whisky as if it had stopped tasting of anything a long time ago. Well, I'm sure you're wrong there, Stewie. Don't you worry your head about it, Stewie said, and reached across the table to thump his friend on the shoulder. But his judgment was way out, and instead he swept Siegfried's bowler from his head. It rolled to the feet of the man at the next table. During the conversation, I had been aware of this gentleman rushing out and trailing slowly back to resume his study of the Pinken and renew his attack on the food and drink. The man looked down at the hat. His face was a picture of misery and frustration, born of too much beer, semi-masticated pork pies, and unwise investment. Convulsively, he lashed out with a foot at the bowler and looked better immediately. The hat, deeply dented, soared back to Siegfried, who caught it and replaced it on his head with unruffled aplomb. He didn't seem in the least annoyed. Apparently considered the man's reaction perfectly normal. We all stood up, and I was mildly surprised by a slight swaying and blurring of my surroundings. When things came to rest, I had another surprise. The big bar was nearly empty. The beer machines were hidden by white cloths. The barmaids were collecting the empty glasses. "Stewie," Siegfried said, "the meeting's over. Do you realise we've been nattering here for over 2 hours? And very nice too. Far better than giving the hard-earned coppers to the bookies." As Stewie rose to his feet, he clutched at the table and stood blinking for a few seconds. "There is one thing, though," Siegfried said. "My friends. I came here with a party, and they must be wondering where I've got to. Tell you what, Stewie, come and meet them. They'll understand when they realise we haven't seen each other for years." We worked our way round to the paddock. No sign of the General and company. We finally found them in the car park, grouped unsmilingly round the Rover. Most of the other cars had gone. Siegfried strode up confidently, his dented bowler cocked at a jaunty angle. "I'm sorry to have left you, but a rather wonderful thing happened back there. I would like to present Mr. Stuart Brannan, a professional colleague and a very dear friend." 4 blank stares turned on Stewie. His big, meaty face was redder than ever, and he smiled sweetly through a faint dew of perspiration. I noticed that he had made a lopsided job of buttoning the navy nap overcoat. There was a spare buttonhole at the top and a lack of alignment at the bottom. It made the straining, tortured garment look even more grotesque. The General nodded curtly. The Colonel appeared to be grinding his teeth. The ladies froze visibly and looked away. Yes, quite," grunted the General. "But we've been waiting here some time, and we want to be getting home." He stuck out his jaw, and his moustache bristled. Siegfried waved a hand. Certainly, by all means. We'll leave right away," he turned to Stewie. "Well, goodbye for now, my lad. We'll get together again soon. I'll ring you." He began to feel through his pockets for his ignition key. He started quite slowly, but gradually stepped up the pace. After he had explored the pockets about 5 times, he stopped, closed his eyes, and appeared to give himself over to intense thought. Then, as though he had decided to do the thing systematically, he commenced to lay out the contents of his pockets one by one, using the car bonnet as a table, and as the pile grew, so did my conviction that doom was very near. It wasn't just the key that worried me. Siegfried had consumed a lot more whisky than I had, and with its usual delayed action, it had begun to creep up on him. He was swaying slightly. His dented bowler had slid forward over one eyebrow, and he kept dropping things as he pulled them from his pocket and examined them owlishly. A man with a long brush and handcart was walking slowly across the car park when Siegfried grabbed his arm. "Look, I want you to do something for me. Here's 5 bob." "Right, mister." The man pocketed the money. "What do you want me to do?" "Find my car key." The man began to peer round Siegfried's feet. "I'll do me best." "Dropped it around here, did you?" No, I've no idea where I dropped it." Siegfried waved vaguely. "It's somewhere on the course." The man looked blank for a moment. Then he gazed out over the acres of littered ground, the carpet of discarded race cards, torn-up tickets. He turned back to Siegfried and giggled suddenly. Then he walked away, still giggling. I stole a glance at our companions. They had watched the search in stony silence, and none of them seemed to be amused. The General was the first to explode.
"Great heavens, Farnon! Have you got the blasted key, or haven't you? If the damn thing's lost, then we better make other arrangements. Can't keep the ladies standing around here."
A gentle cough sounded in the background. Stewie was still there. He shambled forward and whispered in his friend's ear, and after a moment Siegfried wrung his hand fervently.
"By God, Stewie, that's kind of you. You've saved the situation."
He turned back to the party.
"There's nothing to worry about. Mr. Brannan has kindly offered to provide us with transport. He's gone to get his car from the other park."
He pointed triumphantly at the shining back of the bulging navy overcoat, navigating unsteadily through the gate. Siegfried did his best to keep a conversation going, but it was hard slogging. Nobody replied to any of his light sallies, and he stopped abruptly when he saw a look of rage and disbelief spread over the General's face. Stewie had come back. The car was a tiny Austin 7, dwarfed even further by the massive form in the driver's seat. I judged from the rusted maroon paintwork and cracked windows that it must be one of the very earliest models, a Tourer, whose hood had long since disintegrated and been replaced by a homemade canvas cover fastened to the twisted struts by innumerable loops of string. Stewie struggled out, dragged open the passenger door, and inclined his head with modest pride. He motioned towards a pile of sacks which lay on the bare boards where the passenger seats should have been. There were no seats in the back either. Only a couple of rough wooden boxes bearing coloured labels with the legend, "Finest American Apples." From the boxes peeped a jumble of medicine bottles, stethoscopes, powders, syringe cases.
"I thought," said Stewie, "if we put sacks on top of the boxes."
The General didn't let him finish.
"Damn it, is this supposed to be a joke?"
His face was brick red, and the veins on his neck were swelling dangerously.
"Are you trying to insult me friend and these ladies? You want horsewhipping for this afternoon's work, Farnon? That's what you want. Horsewhipping."
He was halted by a sudden roar from the Rover's engine. The Colonel, a man of resource as befitted his rank, had shorted the ignition. Fortunately, the doors were not locked. The General had regained control of himself.
"Get in! I'll drive!"
He barked at Siegfried, as though addressing an erring lance corporal. But Siegfried held up a restraining hand.
"Just one moment," he slurred. "The windscreen's very dirty. I'll give it a rub for you."
The ladies watched him silently as he weaved round to the back of the car and began to rummage in the boot. The love light had died from their eyes. I don't know why he took the trouble. Possibly it was because, through the whisky mists, he felt he must re-establish himself as a competent and helpful member of the party. But the effort fell flat. The effect was entirely spoiled. He was polishing the glass with a dead hen. It was a couple of weeks later, again at the breakfast table, that Siegfried, reading the morning paper with his third cup of coffee, called out to me.
"Ah! I see Herbert Jarvis, MRCVS, one-time Captain RAVC, has been appointed to the North West Circuit as Supervisory Veterinary Surgeon. Well, I know Jarvis. Nice chap. Just the man for the job."
I looked across at my boss for some sign of disappointment or regret. I saw none. Siegfried put down his cup, wiped his lips on his napkin, and sighed contentedly.
"You know, James, everything happens for the best.
Old Stewie was sent by Providence or Heaven or anything you like.
I was never meant to get that job,
and I'd have been as miserable as hell if I had got it.
Come on, lad.
Let's get off into those hills." Chapter 65. After my night at the cinema with Helen, I just seemed to drift naturally into the habit of dropping in to see her on an occasional evening. And before I knew what was happening, I had developed a pattern. Around 8 o'clock, my feet began to make of their own accord for Heston Grange.
Of course, I fought the impulse. I didn't go every night. There was my work, which often occupied me round the clock. There was a feeling of propriety. And there was Mr. Alderson. Helen's father was a vague little man who had withdrawn into himself to a great extent since his wife's death a few years ago. He was an expert stockman, and his farm could compare with the best, but a good part of his mind often seemed to be elsewhere. And he had acquired some little peculiarities. When things weren't going well, he carried on long, muttered conversations with himself. But when he was particularly pleased about something, he was inclined to break into a loud, tuneless humming. It was a penetrating sound, and on my professional visits, I could often locate him by tracking down this characteristic droning among the farm buildings. At first, when I came to see Helen, I'm sure he never even noticed me. I was just one of a crowd of young men who hung around his daughter. But as time went on and my visits became more frequent, he suddenly seemed to become conscious of me and began to regard me with an interest which deepened rapidly into alarm. I couldn't blame him, really. He was devoted to Helen, and it was natural that he should desire a grand match for her. Richard Edmondson represented just that. His family were rich, powerful people, and Richard was very keen indeed. Compared to him, an unknown, impecunious young vet was a poor bargain. When Mr. Alderson was around, my visits were uncomfortable affairs, and it was a pity because I instinctively liked him. He had an amiable, completely inoffensive nature which was very appealing, and under other conditions we would have got along very well. But there was no getting round the fact that he resented me. And it wasn't because he wanted to hang on to Helen. He was an unselfish man, and anyway he had an excellent housekeeper in his sister, who had been recently widowed and had come to live with the Aldersons. Auntie Lucy was a redoubtable character, and was perfectly capable of running the household and looking after the two younger children. It was just that he had got used to the comfortable assumption that one day his daughter would marry the son of his old friend and have a life of untroubled affluence. And he had a stubborn streak which rebelled fiercely against any prospect of change. So it was always a relief when I got out of the house with Helen. Everything was right then. We went to the little dances in the village institutes. We walked for miles along the old grassy mine tracks among the hills, or sometimes she came on my evening calls with me. There wasn't anything spectacular to do in Darrowby, but there was a complete lack of strain. A feeling of being self-sufficient in a warm existence of our own that made everything meaningful and worthwhile. Things might have gone on like this indefinitely, but for a conversation I had with Siegfried. We were sitting in the big room at Scaledale House, as we often did before bedtime, talking over the day's events, when he laughed and slapped his knee. I had old Harry Forster in tonight paying his bill. He was really funny. Sat looking round the room and saying, "It's a nice little nest you have here, Mr. Farnon, a nice little nest." And then, very sly, "It's time there was a bird in this nest, you know. There should be a little bird in here." I laughed too. "Well, you should be used to it by now. You're the most eligible bachelor in Darrowby. People are always having a dig at you. They won't be happy till they've got you married off." "No, wait a minute, not so fast." Siegfried eyed me thoughtfully. "I don't think for a moment that Harry was talking about me. It was you he had in mind." "What do you mean?" "Well, just think. Didn't you say you had run into the old boy one night when you were walking over his land with Helen? He'd be on to a thing like that in a flash. He thinks it's time you were hitched up, that's all." I lay back in my chair and gave myself over to laughter. "Me? Married? Oh, that'll be the day. Can you imagine it? Poor old Harry." Siegfried leant forward. "What are you laughing at, James?" "He's quite right. It's time you were married." "What's that?" I looked at him incredulously. "What do you want about now?" "It's quite simple," he said. "I'm saying you ought to get married, and soon." "Oh, come on, Siegfried, you're joking." "Why should I be?" "Well, damn it, I'm only just starting on my career. I've no money, no nothing. I've never even thought about it." "You've never even... Well, tell me this. Are you courting Helen Alderson, or aren't you?" "Well, I've been, I suppose you could call it that." Siegfried settled back comfortably in his chair, put his fingertips together, and assumed a judicial expression. "Good. Good. You admit you're courting the girl. Now, let us take it a step further. She is, from my own observation, extremely attractive. In fact, she nearly causes a traffic pile-up when she walks across the cobbles at market day. It's common knowledge that she is intelligent, equable, and an excellent cook. Perhaps you would agree with this?" "Well, of course I would," I said, nettled at his superior air. "But what's this all about? Why are you going on like a High Court judge?" "Look, I'm only trying to establish my point, James, which is that you seem to have an ideal wife lined up, and you are doing nothing about it. In fact, not to put too fine a point on it, I wish you'd stop playing around and let us see a little action." "But it's not as simple as that," I said, my voice rising. "I've told you already I'd have to be a lot better off, and anyway, give me a chance. I'd only been going to the house for a few weeks. Surely you don't start thinking of getting married as soon as that. And there's another thing. Her old man doesn't like me." Siegfried put his head on one side, and I gritted my teeth as a saintly expression began to settle on his face. "Now, my dear chap, don't get angry, but there's something I have to tell you for your own good. Caution is often a virtue, but in your case you carry it too far. It's a little flaw in your character, and it shows in a multitude of ways. In your wary approach to problems in your work, for instance, you are always too apprehensive, proceeding fearfully step by step when you should be plunging boldly ahead. You keep seeing dangers when there aren't any. You've got to learn to take a chance, to lash out a bit. As it is, you are confined to a narrow range of activity by your own doubts." "Oh, the original stick in the mud, eh? Oh, come now, James, I didn't say that, but while we're talking, there's another small point I want to bring up. I know you won't mind my saying this. Until you get married, I'm afraid I shall fail to get the full benefit of your assistance in the practice, because, frankly, you are becoming increasingly besotted and bemused to the extent that I'm sure you don't know what you're doing half the time." "What the devil are you talking about? I never heard that kindly hear me out, James. What I'm saying is perfectly true. You're walking about like a man in a dream, and you've developed a disturbing habit of staring into space when I'm talking to you. Now, there's only one cure, my boy, and it's a simple little cure, isn't it?" I shouted. "No money, no home, but leap into matrimony with a happy cry. There's not a thing to worry about." "Aha, you see, there you go again, looking for difficulties." He gave a little laugh and gazed at me with pitying affection. "No money, you say? Well, one of these days you'll be a partner here. Your plate will be out on those railings in front of the house, so you'll never be short of your daily bread. And as regards a home, look at all the empty rooms in this house. You could set up a private suite upstairs without any trouble. So that's just a piffling little detail." I ran my hand distractedly through my hair. My head was beginning to swim. "But you make it all sound so easy." "But it is easy." Siegfried shot upright in his chair. "Go out and ask that girl without further delay and get her into church before the month is out." He wagged a finger at me. "Learn to grasp the nettle of life, James. Throw off your hesitant ways and remember." He clenched his fist and struck an attitude. "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood—" "Okay, I said, rising wearily from my chair. "That's enough. I get the message. I'm going to bed now. And I don't suppose I'm the first person to have had his life fundamentally influenced by one of Siegfried's chance outbursts. I thought his opinions ridiculous at the time, but he planted a seed which germinated and flowered almost overnight. There is no doubt he is responsible for the fact that I was the father of a grown-up family while I was still a young man. Because when I brought the subject up with Helen, she said yes, she'd like to marry me, and we set our eyes on an early date. She seemed surprised at first. Maybe she had the same opinion of me as Siegfried, and expected it would take me a few years to get off the ground. Anyway, before I had time to think much more about it, everything was neatly settled, and I found I had made a magical transition from jeering at the whole idea to making plans for furnishing our prospective bedsitter at Skeldale House. It was a blissful time with only one cloud on the horizon, but that cloud bulked large and forbidding. As I walked hand in hand with Helen, my thoughts in the air, she kept bringing me back to earth with an appealing look. "You know, Jim, you'll really have to speak to Dad. It's time he knew." Chapter 66. I'd been warned long before I qualified that country practice was a dirty, stinking job. I had accepted the fact and adjusted myself to it, but there were times when this side of my life obtruded itself and became almost insupportable. Like now, when even after a long hot bath, I still smelt. As I hoisted myself from the steaming water, I sniffed at my arm, and there it was. The malodorous memory of that horrible cleansing at Tommy Dearlove's, striking triumphantly through all the soap and antiseptic almost as fresh and pungent as it had been at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Nothing but time would move it.
But something in me rebelled at the idea of crawling into bed in this state, and I looked with something like desperation along the row of bottles on the bathroom shelf. I stopped at Mrs. Hall's bath salts, shining violent pink in their big glass jar. This was something I'd never tried before, and I tipped a small handful into the water around my feet. For a moment my head swam as the rising steam was suddenly charged with an aggressive sweetness. Then, on an impulse, I shook most of the jar's contents into the bath and lowered myself once more under the surface. For a long time I lay there smiling to myself in triumph as the oily liquid lapped around me. Not even Tommy Dearlove's cleansing could survive this treatment. The whole process had a stupefying effect on me, and I was half asleep even as I sank back on the pillow. There followed a few moments of blissful floating before a delicious slumber claimed me. And when the bedside phone boomed in my ear, the sense of injustice and personal affront was even stronger than usual. Blinking sleepily at the clock which said 1:15 a.m., I lifted the receiver and mumbled into it. But I was jerked suddenly wide awake when I recognized Mr. Alderson's voice. Candy was carving and something was wrong. Would I come right away? There has always been a "this is where I came in" feeling after a night call. And as my light swept the cobbles of the deserted marketplace, it was there again. A sense of returning to fundamentals, of really being me. The silent houses, the tight-drawn curtains, the long, empty street giving way to the stone walls of the country road, flipping endlessly past on either side. At these times, I was usually in a state of suspended animation, just sufficiently awake to steer the car in the right direction, but tonight I was fully alert, my mind ticking over anxiously, because Candy was something special. She was the house cow, a pretty little Jersey and Mr. Alderson's particular pet. She was the sole member of her breed in the herd. But whereas the milk from the shorthorns went into the churns to be collected by the big dairy, Candy's rich yellow offering found its way onto the family porridge every morning, or appeared heaped up on trifles and fruit pies, or was made into butter, a golden, creamy butter to make you dream. But apart from all that, Mr. Alderson just liked the animal. He usually stopped opposite her on his way down the byre, and began to hum to himself and give her tail head a brief scratch as he passed. And I couldn't blame him, because I sometimes wish all cows were Jerseys, small, gentle, doe-eyed creatures you could push around without any trouble, with padded corners and fragile limbs. Even if they kicked you, it was like a love tap compared with the clump from a craggy Frisian. I just hoped it would be something simple with Candy, because my stock wasn't high with Mr. Alderson, and I had a nervous conviction that he wouldn't react favourably if I started to make a ham-fisted job of carving his little favourite. I shrugged away my fears. Obstetrics in the Jersey were usually easy. Helen's father was an efficient farmer. As I pulled up in the yard, I could see into the lighted loose box where 2 buckets of water were steaming in readiness for me. A towel was draped over the half-door, and Stan and Bert, the 2 long-serving cowmen, were standing alongside their boss. Candy was lying comfortably in deep straw. She wasn't straining, and there was nothing visible at the vulva, but the cow had a preoccupied inward look, as though all was not well with her. I closed the door behind me. "Have you had a feel inside her, Mr. Alderson?" "Aye, I've had me hand in, and there's nowt there." "Nothing at all?" "Not a thing." "She's been on for a few hours and not showing, so I put me hand in, and there's no head, no legs, nowt. Not much rum either. That's when I rang you." This sounded very strange. I hung my jacket on a nail and began thoughtfully to unbutton my shirt. It was when I was pulling it over my head that I noticed Mr. Alderson's nose wrinkling. The farm men, too, began to sniff and look at each other wonderingly. Mrs. Hall's bath salts, imprisoned under my clothing, had burst from their bondage in a sickly wave, filling the enclosed space with their strident message. Hurriedly I began to wash my arms in the hope that the alien odour might pass away. But it seemed to get worse, welling from my warm skin, competing incongruously with the honest smells of cow hay and straw. Nobody said anything. These men weren't the type to make the ribald remark which would have enabled me to laugh the whole thing off. There was no ambiguity about this scent. It was voluptuously feminine, and Bert and Stan stared at me open-mouthed. Mr. Alderson, his mouth turned down at the corners, his nostrils still twitching, kept his eyes fixed on the far wall. Cringing inwardly, I knelt behind the cow, and in a moment my embarrassment was forgotten. The vagina was empty. A smooth passage narrowing rapidly to a small, rigid opening, just wide enough to admit my hand. Beyond, I could feel the feet and head of a calf. My spirits plummeted. Torsion of the uterus. There was going to be no easy victory for me here. I sat back on my heels and turned to the farmers. She's got a twisted calf bed. There's a live calf in there, all right, but there's no way out for it. I can barely get my hand through. I thought there was something peculiar. Mr. Alderson rubbed his chin and looked at me doubtfully. What can we do about it, then? We'll have to try to correct the twist by rolling the cow over while I keep hold of the calf. It's a good job there's plenty of us here. And that'll put everything right, will it? I swallowed. I didn't like these jobs. Sometimes rolling worked, and sometimes it didn't, and in those days we hadn't quite got round to performing caesareans on cows. If I was unsuccessful, I had the prospect of telling Mr. Alderson to send Candy to the butcher. I banished the thought quickly. I'll put everything right, I said. I had to. I stationed Bert at the front legs, Stan at the hind, and the farmer holding the cow's head on the floor. Then I stretched myself on the hard concrete, pushed in a hand, and grasped the calf's foot. Now, roll her, I gasped, and the men pulled the legs round in a clockwise direction. I held fiercely to the little feet as the cow flopped onto her other side. Nothing seemed to be happening inside. Push her onto her chest, I panted. Stan and Bert expertly tucked the legs under the cow and rolled her onto her brisket, and as she settled there, I gave a yell of pain. Get her back, quick! We're going the wrong way! The smooth band of tissue had tightened on my wrist in a numbing grip of frightening power. For a moment, I had the panicking impression that I'd never get out of there again. But the men worked like lightning. Within seconds, Candy was stretched out on her original side. The pressure was off my arm, and we were back where we started. I gritted my teeth and took a fresh grip on the calf's foot. Okay. Try her the other way. This time the roll was anti-clockwise, and we went through 180 degrees without anything happening. I only just kept my grasp on the foot. The resistance this time was tremendous. Taking a breather for a few seconds, I lay face down while the sweat sprang out on my back, sending out fresh exotic vapours from the bath salts. Right. One more go, I cried, and the men hauled the cow further over. And oh, it was beautiful to feel everything magically unravelling, and my arm lying free in a wide uterus with all the room in the world, and the calf already beginning to slide towards me. Candy summed up the situation immediately, and for the first time she gave a determined, heaving strain. Sensing victory just round the corner, she followed up with another prolonged effort which popped the calf, wet and wriggling, into my arms. By gum, it was quick at finish, Mr. Alderson murmured wonderingly. He seized a wisp of hay and began to dry off the little creature. Thankfully, I soaked my arms in one of the buckets. After every delivery, there is a feeling of relief, but in this case, it was overwhelming. It no longer mattered that the loose box smelt like a lady's hairdressing salon. I just felt good. I said good night to Bert and Stan as they returned to their beds, giving a final incredulous sniff as they passed me. Mr. Alderson was pottering about, having a word with Candy, then starting again on the calf, which he had already rubbed down several times. He seemed fascinated by it. And I couldn't blame him, because it was like something out of Disney. A pale gold fawn, unbelievably tiny, with large, dark, limpid eyes, and an expression of trusting innocence. It was a heifer, too. The farmer lifted it as if it were a whippet dog and laid it by the mother's head. Candy nosed the little animal over, rumbling happily in her throat. Then she began to lick it. I watched Mr. Alderson. He was standing, hands clasped behind him, rocking backwards and forwards on his heels, obviously enchanted by the scene. Any time now, I thought. And I was right. The tuneless humming broke out, even louder than usual, like a joyful paean. I stiffened in my Wellingtons. There would never be a better time. After a nervous cough, I spoke up firmly. Mr. Alderson, I said, and he half turned his head. I would like to marry your daughter. The humming was switched off abruptly, and he turned slowly till he was facing me. He didn't speak, but his eyes searched my face, unhappily. Then he bent stiffly, picked up the buckets one by one, tipped out the water, and made for the door. You better come in the house, he said. The farmhouse kitchen looked lost and forsaken with the family abed. I sat in a high-backed wooden chair by the side of the empty hearth while Mr. Alderson put away his buckets, hung up the towel and washed his hands methodically at the sink, Then he pottered through to the parlour, and I heard him bumping and clinking about in the sideboard. When he reappeared, he bore a tray in front of him on which a bottle of whisky and 2 glasses rattled gently. The tray lent the simple procedure an air of formality, which was accentuated by the heavy cut crystal of the glasses and the virgin, unopened state of the bottle. Mr. Alderson set the tray down on the kitchen table, which he dragged nearer to us before settling in the chair at the other side of the fireplace. Nobody said anything. I waited in the lengthening silence while he peered at the cap of the bottle like a man who had never seen one before, then unscrewed it with a slow apprehension as though he feared it might blow up in his face. Finally he poured out 2 measures with the utmost gravity and precision, ducking his head frequently to compare the levels in the 2 glasses, and with a last touch of ceremony proffered the laden tray. I took my drink and waited, expectantly. Mr. Alderson looked into the lifeless fireplace for a minute or 2. Then he directed his gaze upwards at the oil painting of the paddling cows which hung above the mantelpiece. He pursed his lips as though about to whistle, but appeared to change his mind, and, without salutation, took a gulp of his whisky, which sent him into a paroxysm of coughing from which it took him some time to recover. When his breathing had returned to normal, he sat up straight and fixed me with streaming eyes. He cleared his throat, and I felt a certain tension. "Aye, well," he said. "It's grand hay weather." I agreed with him, and he looked round the kitchen with the interested stare of a total stranger. Having completed this inspection, he took another copious swallow from his glass, grimaced, closed his eyes, shook his head violently a few times, then leant forward. "Mind you," he said, "a night's rain would do a lot of good." I gave my opinion that it undoubtedly would, and the silence fell again. It lasted even longer this time, and my host kept drinking his whisky as though he was getting used to it. And I could see it was having a relaxing effect. The strained lines on his face were beginning to smooth out, and his eyes were losing their hunted look. Nothing more was said until he had replenished our glasses, balancing the amounts meticulously again. He took a sip at his second measure, then he looked down at the rug and spoke in a small voice. "James," he said, "I had a wife in 1,000. I was so surprised I hardly knew what to say. "Yes, I know," I murmured. "I've heard a lot about her." Mr. Alderson went on, still looking down, his voice full of gentle yearning. "Yes. She was the grandest lass for miles around, and the bonniest." He looked up at me suddenly with the ghost of a smile. "Nobody thought you'd ever have a fellow like me, you know. But you did." He paused and looked away. "Aye, she did." He began to tell me about his dead wife. He told me calmly, without self-pity, but with a wistful gratitude for the happiness he had known. And I discovered that Mr. Alderson was different from a lot of the farmers of his generation, because he said nothing about her being a good worker. So many of the women of those times seemed to be judged mainly on their working ability. And when I had first come to Darrowby, I had been shocked when I commiserated with a newly widowed old man. He had brushed a tear from his eye and said, "Aye, she was a grand worker." But Mr. Alderson said only that his wife had been beautiful, that she had been kind, and that he had loved her very much. He talked about Helen, too, about the things she'd said and done when she was a little girl, about how very like her mother she was in every way. He never said anything about me, but I had the feeling all the time that he meant it to concern me. And the very fact that he was talking so freely seemed a sign that the barriers were coming down. Actually, he was talking a little too freely. He was halfway down his 3rd huge whisky, and, in my experience, Yorkshiremen just couldn't take the stuff. I had seen burly 10-pint men from the local pub keel over after a mere whiff at the amber fluid, and little Mr. Alderson hardly drank at all. I was getting worried. But there was nothing I could do, so I let him ramble on happily. He was lying right back in his chair now, completely at ease, his eyes alight with his memories gazing somewhere above my head. In fact, I am convinced he had forgotten I was there, because after one long passage he dropped his eyes, caught sight of me,
and stared for a moment without recognition. When he did manage to place me, it seemed to remind him of his duties as a host. But as he reached again for the bottles, he caught sight of the clock on the wall. "Well, dang it. It's 4 o'clock. We've been here long enough. It's hardly worth going to bed, but I suppose you'd better have an hour or two sleep." He tipped the last of the whisky down his throat, jumped briskly to his feet, looked around him for a few moments in a businesslike sort of way, then pitched head first with a sickening clatter among the fire irons. Frozen with horror, I started forward to help the small figure scrabbling on the hearth. But I needn't have worried, because he bounced back to his feet in a second or two and looked me in the eye as if nothing had happened. "Well, I'd better be off," I said. "Thanks for the drink." There was no point in staying longer, as I realised that the chances of Mr. Alderson saying, "Bless you, my son," or anything like that were remote. But I had a comforting impression that all was going to be well. As I made my way to the door, the farmer made a creditable attempt to usher me out. But his direction was faulty, and he tacked helplessly away from me across the kitchen floor before collapsing against a tall dresser. From under a row of willow-patterned dinner plates, his face looked at me with simple bewilderment. I hesitated, then turned back. "I'll just walk up the stairs with you, Mr. Alderson," I said in a matter-of-fact voice, and the little man made no resistance as I took his arm and guided him towards the door in the far corner. As we creaked our way upstairs, he stumbled and would have gone down again had I not grabbed him round the waist. As I caught him, he looked up at me and grunted, "Thanks, lad," and we grinned at each other for a moment before restarting the climb. I supported him across the landing to his bedroom door, and he stood hesitating as though about to say something. But finally he just nodded to me a couple of times before ducking inside. I waited outside the door, listening in some anxiety to the bumps and thumps from within. But I relaxed as a loud, tuneless humming came through the panels. Everything most certainly was going to be all right. Chapter 67. Considering we spent our honeymoon tuberculin testing, it was a big success. It compared favourably, at any rate, with the experiences of a lot of people I know who celebrated this milestone in their lives by cruising for a month on sunny seas and still wrote it off as a dead loss. For Helen and me, it had all the ingredients: laughter, fulfilment, and camaraderie. And yet it only lasted a week. And as I say, we spent it tuberculin testing. The situation had its origins one morning at the breakfast table, when Siegfried, red-eyed after a bad night with a colicky mare, was opening the morning mail. He drew his breath in sharply as a thick roll of forms fell from an official envelope. God almighty! God, look at all that testing! He smoothed out the forms on the tablecloth and read feverishly down a long list of farm premises. "And they want us to start this lot around Ellerthorpe next week without fail. It's very urgent." He glanced at me for a moment. "That's when you're getting married, isn't it?" I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. "Yes, I'm afraid it is." Siegfried snatched a piece of toast from the rack and began to slap butter on it. "Well, this is just great, isn't it? The practice going mad, a week's testing right at the top of the Dale, away in the back of beyond, and your wedding smack in the middle of it. You'll be drifting gaily off on your honeymoon without a care in the world, while I'm rushing around here, nearly disappearing up my own backside." He bit a piece from the toast and began to chew it worriedly. "I'm sorry, Siegfried," I said. "I didn't mean to land you in the cart like this. I couldn't know the practice was going to get so busy right now, and I never expected them to throw all this testing at us." Siegfried paused in his chewing and pointed a finger at me. "Well, that's just it, James. That's your trouble. You don't look ahead. You just go belting straight on without a thought. Even when it comes to a bloody wedding, you're not worried. Oh, no, let's get on with it. To hell with the consequences." He paused to cough up a few crumbs which he had inhaled in his agitation. "In fact, I can't see what all the hurry is. You've got all the time in the world to get married. You're just a boy. And another thing, you hardly know this girl. You've only been seeing her regularly for a few weeks." "But just a minute. You said—" "Now let me finish, James. Marriage is a very serious step, not to be embarked upon without long and serious thought. Why, in God's name, does it have to be next week? Next year would have been soon enough, and you could have enjoyed a nice long engagement, but no, you had to rush in and tie the knot, and it isn't so easily untied, you know. Oh, hell, Siegfried, this is too bad. You know perfectly well it was you who, one moment more. Your precipitate marital arrangements are going to cause me a considerable headache, but believe me, I wish you well. I hope all turns out for the best despite your complete lack of foresight, but at the same time I must remind you of the old saying, marry in haste, repent at leisure. I could stand no more. I leapt to my feet, thumped a fist on the table, and yelled at him. But damn it all, it was your idea! I was all for leaving it for a bit, but you— Siegfried wasn't listening. He had been cooling off all the time, and now his face broke into a seraphic smile. Now, James, you're getting excited again. Sit down and calm yourself. You mustn't mind my speaking to you like this. You are very young, and it's my duty. You haven't done anything wrong at all. Well, I suppose it's the most natural thing in the world for people of your age to act without thinking ahead, to jump into things with never a thought of the morrow. It's just the improvidence of youth. Siegfried was about 6 years older than me, but he had donned the mantle of the omniscient greybeard without effort. I dug my fingers into my knees and decided not to pursue the matter. I had no chance anyway, and besides, I was beginning to feel a bit worried about clearing off and leaving him snowed under with work. I got up and walked to the window where I watched old Will Varley pushing a bicycle up the street, with a sack of potatoes balanced on the handlebars as I had watched him 100 times before. Then I turned back to my employer. I had had one of my infrequent ideas. Look, Siegfried, I wouldn't mind spending my honeymoon around Ellithorpe. Oh, it's wonderful up there at this time of year, and we could stay at the Wheatsheaf, and I could do the testing from there. He looked at me in astonishment. Spend it at Ellithorpe? And testing? Oh, it's impossible. What would Helen say? Well, she wouldn't mind. In fact, she could do the writing for me. We were only going off touring in the car, so we haven't made any plans, and anyway, it's funny, but Helen and I have often said we'd like to stay at the Wheatsheaf sometime. There is something about that little pub. Siegfried shook his head decisively. No, James, I won't hear of it. In fact, you're beginning to make me feel guilty. I'll get through the work all right, so forget about it and go away and have a good time. No, I've made up my mind. I'm really beginning to like the idea. I scanned the list quickly. Now, I can start testing at Allen's and do all those smaller ones around there on Tuesday, get married on Wednesday and go back for the second injection and readings on Thursday and Friday. I can knock hell out of that list by the end of the week. Siegfried looked at me as though he was seeing me for the first time. He argued and protested, but for once, I got my way. I fished the ministry notification cards from the desk drawer and began to make the arrangements for my honeymoon. On Tuesday at 12 noon, I had finished testing the Allens' huge herd scattered for miles over the stark fells at the top of the dale, and was settling down with the hospitable folk for the inevitable bitter dinner. Mr. Allen was at the head of the scrubbed table, and facing me were his two sons, Jack, aged about 20, and Robbie, about 17. The young men were superbly fit and tough, and I had been watching all morning in something like awe as they manhandled the wild, scattered beasts, chasing and catching tirelessly hour after hour. I had stared incredulously as Jack had run down a galloping heifer on the open moor, seized its horns and borne it slowly to the ground for me to inject. It struck me more than once that it was a pity that an Olympic selector was unlikely to stray into this remote corner of High Yorkshire. He would have found some world-beating material. I always had to stand a bit of leg-pulling from Mrs. Allen, a jolly, talkative woman. On previous visits she had ribbed me mercilessly about being a slow coach with the girls, the disgrace of having nothing better than a housekeeper to look after me. I knew she would start on me again today, but I bided my time. I had a devastating riposte up my sleeve. She had just opened the oven door, filling the room with a delectable fragrance, and as she dumped a huge slab of roast ham on the table, she looked down at me with a smile. Now then, Mr. Herriot, when are we going to get you married off? It's time you found a nice girl, you know. I'm always at you, but you take a bit of notice. She giggled as she bustled back to the cooking range for a bowl of mashed potatoes. I waited until she returned before I dropped my bombshell. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Allen, I said airily, I've decided to accept your advice. I'm getting married tomorrow. The good woman, mounding mashed potatoes onto my plate, stopped with her spoon in mid-air. Married tomorrow? Her face was a study in blank astonishment. That's right.
I thought you'd be pleased. But you're coming back here to read the test on Thursday and Friday? Well, of course. I have to finish the test, haven't I? I'll be bringing my wife with me. I'm looking forward to introducing her to you. There was a silence. The young men stared at me. Mr. Allen stopped sawing at the ham and regarded me stolidly. Then his wife gave an uncertain laugh. Oh, come on! I don't believe it! You're kidding us. You'll be off on your honeymoon if you're getting married tomorrow. Mrs. Allen, I said with dignity, I wouldn't joke about a serious matter like that. Let me repeat. Tomorrow is my wedding day, and I'll be bringing my wife along on Thursday to see you. Completely deflated, she heaped our plates, and we all fell to in silence. But I knew she was in agony. She kept darting little glances at me, and it was obvious she was dying to ask me more. The boys, too, seemed intrigued. Only Mr. Allen, a tall, quiet man who I'm sure wouldn't have cared if I'd been going to rob a bank tomorrow, ploughed calmly through his food. Nothing more was said until I was about to leave. Then Mrs. Allen put a hand on my arm. You really don't mean it, do you? Her face was haggard with strain. I got into the car and called out through the window. Goodbye, and thank you, Mrs. Allen. Mrs. Herriot and I will be along first thing on Thursday. I can't remember much about the wedding. It was a quiet do, and my main recollection is of desiring to get it all over with as soon as possible. I have only one vivid memory, of Siegfried just behind me in the church booming Amen at regular intervals throughout the ceremony. The only time I've ever heard a best man do this. It was an incredible relief when Helen and I were ready to drive away, and when we were passing Skeldale House, Helen grasped my hand. Look, she said excitedly. Look over there. Underneath Siegfried's brass plate, which always hung slightly askew on the iron railings, was a brand new one. It was of the modern Bakelite type, with a black background and bold white letters which read, J. Herriot, MRCBS, veterinary surgeon, and it was screwed very straight and level on the metal. Siegfried had said something about, You'll see my wedding present on the way out. And here it was. Not many people get a partnership as a gift, but it had happened to me, and was the crowning point of 3 years of magnanimity. I looked back down the street to try to see Siegfried, but we had said our goodbyes, and I would have to thank him later. So I drove out of Darrowby with a feeling of swelling pride because I knew what the plate meant. I was a man with a real place in the world. The thought made me slightly breathless. In fact, we were both a little dizzy, and we cruised for hours around the countryside, getting out when we felt like it, walking among the hills, taking no account of time. It must have been 9 o'clock in the evening and the darkness coming in fast when we realized we had gone far out of our way. We had to drive 10 miles over a desolate moor on the fell top, and it was very dark when we rattled down the steep, narrow road into Ellithorpe. The Wheatsheaf was an unostentatious part of a single long village street, a low grey stone building with no light over the door, and as we went into the slightly musty-smelling hallway, the gentle clink of glasses came from the public bar on our left. Mrs. Byrne, the elderly widow who owned the place, appeared from a back room and scrutinised us unemotionally. "We've met before, Mrs. Byrne," I said, and she nodded. I apologised for our lateness and was wondering whether I dared ask for a few sandwiches at this time of the night, when the old lady spoke up quite unperturbed. "Nay," she said, "it's right. We've been expecting you, and your supper's waiting." She led us to the dining room, where her niece Beryl served a hot meal in no time. Thick lentil soup, followed by what would probably be called a goulash these days, but which was in fact simply a delicious stew with mushrooms and vegetables, obviously concocted by a culinary genius. We had to say no to the gooseberry pie and cream. It was like that all the time at the Wheatsheaf. The whole place was aggressively unfashionable, needing a lick of paint, crammed with hideous Victorian furniture, but it was easy to see how it had won its reputation. It didn't have stylish guests, but fat, comfortable men from the industrial West Riding brought their wives at the weekends, and did a bit of fishing or just took in the incomparable air between the mealtimes which were the big moments of the day. There was only one guest while we were there, and he was a permanent one, a retired draper from Darlington, who was always at the table in good time, a huge white napkin tucked under his chin, his eyes gleaming as he watched Beryl bring in the food. But it wasn't just the home-fed ham, the Wensleydale cheese, the succulent steak and kidney pies, the Bilberry tarts and mountainous Yorkshire puddings which captivated Helen and me. There was a peace, a sleepy, insinuating charm about the old pub which we always recall with happiness. I still often pass the Wheatsheaf, and as I look at its ancient stone frontage, quite unaltered by the passage of a mere 30 years, the memories are still fresh and warm. Our footsteps echoing in the empty street when we took our last walk at night, the old brass bedstead almost filling the little room, the dark rim of the fells bulking against the night sky beyond our window, faint bursts of laughter from the farmers in the bar downstairs. I particularly enjoyed, too, our very first morning when I took Helen to do the test at Allen's. As I got out of the car, I could see Mrs. Allen peeping round the curtains in the kitchen window. She was soon out in the yard, and her eyes popped when I brought my bride over to her. Helen was one of the pioneers of slacks in the Dales, and she was wearing a bright purple pair this morning, which would, in modern parlance, knock your eye out. The farmer's wife was partly shocked, partly fascinated, but she soon found that Helen was of the same stock as herself, and within seconds the two women were chattering busily. I judged from Mrs. Allen's vigorous head-nodding and her ever-widening smile that Helen was putting her out of her pain by explaining all the circumstances. It took a long time, and finally Mr. Allen had to break into the conversation. "If we're going, we'll have to go," he said gruffly, and we set off to start the second day of the test. We began on a sunny hillside where a group of young animals had been penned. Jack and Robbie plunged in among the beasts, while Mr. Allen took off his cap and courteously dusted the top of the wall. "Your missus can sit here," he said. I paused as I was about to start measuring. My missus. It was the first time anybody had said that to me. I looked over at Helen as she sat cross-legged on the rough stones, a notebook on her knee, pencil at the ready, and as she pushed back the shining hair from her forehead, she caught my eye and smiled. And as I smiled back at her, I became aware suddenly of the vast, swelling glory of the Dales around us, and of the Dales' scent of clover and warm grass, more intoxicating than any wine. And it seemed that my first 3 years at Darrowby had been leading up to this moment, that the first big step of my life was being completed right here with Helen smiling at me, and the memory fresh in my mind of my new plate hanging in front of Scaledale House. I might have stood there indefinitely in a sort of trance, but Mr. Allen cleared his throat in a marked manner